The emergence of psychoactive substance use in the territories that would eventually become England began not as a matter of recreational pursuit or medical necessity, but as an intrinsic component of religious ritual and communal practices among the Celtic and pre-Celtic populations inhabiting the British Isles during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. Archaeological evidence from sites across southern Britain, particularly in regions corresponding to modern Wessex and the Thames Valley, reveals patterns of plant cultivation and consumption that suggest systematic use of naturally occurring psychoactive materials by populations living between 1500 and 500 years before the Common Era. These early inhabitants possessed sophisticated botanical knowledge accumulated through centuries of observation and experimentation, enabling them to identify, cultivate, and process plants containing compounds that altered consciousness, relieved pain, or facilitated what they understood as communication with supernatural forces governing agricultural fertility, military success, and communal prosperity. The Druids, who served as religious authorities, legal advisors, and repositories of traditional knowledge among Celtic populations, maintained carefully guarded expertise regarding the preparation and administration of psychoactive plants. Their training, which contemporary Roman sources suggest, required up to 20 years of oral instruction and memorization, included detailed understanding of which plants produce specific effects, appropriate harvesting times to maximize potency, proper preparation methods to ensure safety, and ritual contexts that determined acceptable use. The secrecy surrounding this knowledge reflected both its perceived sacred character and the political power that control over consciousness-altering substances provided to religious specialists who mediated between human communities and divine forces. The Roman conquest, initiated by Emperor Claudius in 43 of the Common Era, brought Mediterranean perspectives on intoxication and altered consciousness into direct contact with Celtic practices, creating tensions and exchanges that would influence British approaches to psychoactive substances for centuries. Roman military commanders and colonial administrators documented their observations of Celtic religious practices with varying degrees of accuracy and considerable cultural bias, providing the earliest written accounts of substance use in Britain, while simultaneously imposing Roman legal frameworks that regulated certain forms of intoxication, while tolerating others according to Mediterranean social problem conventions. The natural pharmacopoeia available to pre-Roman populations in Britain included several plants with significant psychoactive properties that grew wild throughout the islands, or could be cultivated in the temperate maritime climate. Henbane, a member of the nightshade family, containing tropane alkaloids that produce delirium, hallucinations, and amnesia, grew proliferating in disturbed soils near human settlements, and was recognized by ancient peoples as possessing powerful consciousness-altering effects. Archaeological excavations of Iron Age sites have recovered henbane seeds in contexts suggesting deliberate cultivation or collection, while the plant's association with magic and prophecy in later folk traditions likely preserves memories of its earlier ritual uses. The dosage required to produce psychoactive effects lay dangerously close to toxic levels, making henbane administration a specialized skill requiring extensive experience to avoid fatal overdoses while achieving desired states of altered consciousness. The preparation methods that rendered henbane safe for intentional consumption involved careful selection of plant parts, precise timing of harvest to manage alkaloid concentrations, and processing techniques that modified the proportions of different active compounds to reduce toxicity while maintaining psychoactive efficacy. Deadly nightshade, another tropane-containing plant native to Britain, possessed even more potent and dangerous alkaloid profiles that produced profound alterations in perception, cognition, and physiological function. The plant's berries contained concentrations of atropine and related compounds sufficient to cause complete dissociation from normal consciousness, accompanied by severe physiological effects including rapid heartbeat, elevated body temperature, and potentially fatal disruption of normal cardiac and respiratory function. The extreme danger associated with nightshade consumption meant that its use remained confined to contexts where skilled practitioners could monitor subjects and provide interventions if toxic reactions developed beyond manageable levels. Evidence for deliberate nightshade use in ancient Britain remains more speculative than for other psychoactive plants, but the prominence of nightshade in later folklore concerning witchcraft and magic suggests that knowledge of its consciousness-altering properties had ancient origins, even if direct archaeological evidence proves elusive. Fly agaric mushrooms, the distinctive red-capped fungi containing muscimol and related compounds that produce dissociative experiences markedly different from tropane alkaloid effects, grew in birch and pine woodlands throughout Britain during favorable seasonal conditions. The mushroom's striking appearance made them easily identifiable, even for individuals without specialized botanical training, while their effects, though unpredictable and often unpleasant, rarely proved fatal when consumed in quantities that might be ingested accidentally or experimentally. Some scholars have proposed that fly agaric played roles in shamanic practices among northern European populations, though direct evidence for such use in ancient Britain remains limited and controversial. The mushroom's distribution in woodland environments meant that knowledge of their locations and fruiting seasons provided valuable information for those seeking their consciousness-altering effects, creating another category of specialized knowledge that enhanced the status of individuals who possessed it. Hemp cultivation arrived in Britain during the later Iron Age through trade contacts with continental populations who had adopted the plant for fiber production, creating opportunities for discovery of the psychoactive properties possessed by female cannabis plants when consumed in sufficient quantities. The primary motivation for hemp cultivation remained the production of strong fibers suitable for rope and textile manufacture, but the plant's psychoactive potential could not have remained unknown to populations who worked extensively with cannabis during harvest and processing operations. The relatively mild consciousness-altering effects produced by cannabis consumption, compared to the dramatic and dangerous alterations induced by nightshade or henbane, may have led to its classification as a less significant psychoactive plant, despite its greater safety margin and more consistent effects. Archaeological evidence for early cannabis cultivation in Britain remains sparse, making definitive statements about the extent and purposes of pre-Roman hemp production difficult to establish, with the precision that characterizes understanding of continental European cannabis use during comparable periods. The opium poppy, source of the most significant narcotic substances known to ancient Mediterranean civilizations, reached Britain through Roman trade networks and possibly earlier contact with continental populations who had adopted poppy cultivation from eastern Mediterranean sources. The plant's primary value lay in the latex derived from immature seed capsules, which contained morphine and related alkaloids, producing powerful analgesic effects alongside euphoria, sedation, and psychological dependence with repeated use. Roman physicians and their British successors recognized opium as the most effective pain reliever available in the ancient pharmacopoeia, prescribing it for conditions ranging from severe injuries to chronic diseases, while remaining aware of the dangerous potential for habituation. The cultivation of opium poppies in Britain during the Roman period and afterward provided local sources of medicinal narcotic materials, reducing dependence on imported supplies while establishing British familiarity with opium's effects and applications that would persist through subsequent historical periods. The Roman occupation transformed British society across multiple dimensions, including urbanization patterns, economic organization, legal systems, and religious practices, with corresponding influences on the contexts and methods of psychoactive substance use. Roman military culture included formalized patterns of alcohol consumption that differed from Celtic traditions, introducing wine as a prestige beverage and implementing regulations governing when, where, and how soldiers could consume intoxicating drinks. The construction of urban centers with Roman-style bathhouses, theaters, and temples created new social spaces where substance use occurred according to Mediterranean cultural conventions rather than Celtic ritual practices. The gradual adoption of Roman customs by British elites seeking status within the colonial hierarchy promoted Mediterranean approaches to intoxication while marginalizing indigenous practices associated with Druids and other Celtic religious specialists. The Roman military's systematic suppression of druidic practices, motivated by political concerns about potential centers of resistance to imperial authority, disrupted the transmission of traditional knowledge regarding psychoactive plant preparation and ritual use, creating discontinuities in British substance use traditions that would influence later developments. Roman medical practitioners operating in Britain brought sophisticated pharmacological knowledge derived from Greek medical theories and Mediterranean botanical resources, establishing traditions of substance use justified by therapeutic rationales rather than religious or recreational purposes. The works of Dioscorides, Galen, and other medical authorities provided theoretical frameworks for understanding how different substances affected the body's humoral balance, offering explanations for both beneficial therapeutic effects and dangerous toxic reactions. Roman military physicians, treating soldiers wounded in conflicts with resistant British populations or injured during construction projects, employed opium, henbane, and other psychoactive plants as anesthetics and analgesics, demonstrating applications that would be preserved in medical traditions long after Roman political authority collapsed. The establishment of Roman towns created urban populations with different substance use patterns than rural agricultural communities, including greater access to imported materials like wine and potentially different attitudes toward intoxication, shaped by Mediterranean cultural influences. The collapse of Roman authority in Britain during the early 5th century created political fragmentation and economic disruption that affected substance use patterns through reduced access to imported materials, breakdown of urban social structures that had supported Roman-style consumption practices, and the revival of Celtic cultural traditions that had persisted in modified forms throughout the occupation period. The Anglo-Saxon migrations that followed Roman withdrawal brought new populations with their own substance use traditions, including heavy emphasis on mead and beer consumption in communal feasting contexts that served important social and political functions. The gradual Anglo-Saxon conquest of lowland Britain over the 5th through 7th centuries created a complex cultural landscape where Celtic, Roman, and Germanic traditions coexisted and influenced each other in ways that shaped the development of substance use practices. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, beginning in the late 6th century, introduced yet another set of cultural influences on substance use. As Christian religious authorities brought Mediterranean attitudes toward intoxication, alongside theological frameworks that classified certain consciousness-altering experiences as demonic rather than divine. The monastic institutions that proliferated across Anglo-Saxon England following the initial conversions maintained and developed medical knowledge inherited from Roman sources, preserving understanding of psychoactive plant properties within Christian frameworks that distinguished legitimate therapeutic applications from forbidden magical practices. Monastic libraries contained copies of classical medical texts that described opium, henbane, and other psychoactive substances, while monastery gardens cultivated medicinal plants, including poppies and various species with consciousness-altering properties. The monks who served as medical practitioners for both monastic communities and surrounding populations prepared remedies containing psychoactive ingredients according to formulas derived from ancient sources and modified through practical experience, maintaining chains of pharmaceutical knowledge that connected Anglo-Saxon England with Greco-Roman medical traditions. The distinction that Christian authorities drew between legitimate medical use of consciousness-altering substances and forbidden recreational or magical applications established conceptual frameworks that would influence British drug policy for over a millennium, creating categories that defined certain substance uses as morally acceptable, while condemning others as sinful or criminal. The Viking raids and subsequent Scandinavian settlements that began in the late 8th century introduced additional cultural influences on British substance use patterns, particularly regarding alcohol consumption practices that emphasized prodigious intake during communal celebrations and ritual occasions. Norse sagas and other literary sources describe warriors consuming substantial quantities of mead and beer before battles, attributing enhanced combat capabilities to intoxication rather than viewing it as an impediment to military effectiveness. Some scholars have speculated about possible use of fly agaric or other psychoactive substances by Viking berserkers, though solid evidence for such practices remains elusive, and alternative explanations for berserker behavior, emphasizing psychological and cultural factors rather than pharmacological intervention, appear equally plausible. The establishment of the Danelaw and eventual integration of Scandinavian populations into English society created cultural exchanges that influenced drinking customs, social attitudes toward intoxication, and possibly knowledge of psychoactive plants known to Norse populations but previously unfamiliar in England. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought England under the control of a French-speaking aristocracy with cultural connections to continental European traditions, creating new contexts for substance use among elite populations, while existing patterns persisted among the bulk of the population. The introduction of wine culture, associated with French nobility, established patterns of consumption that marked social status. As expensive imported wines became symbols of aristocratic identity that distinguished Norman elites from the English populations they governed. The development of extensive trading networks connecting England with Mediterranean regions facilitated importation of not only wine, but also spices, medicines, and other materials that included psychoactive substances. The growth of universities at Oxford and Cambridge during the 12th and 13th centuries created institutional centres where medical knowledge could be systematically studied, taught, and advanced, establishing communities of learned practitioners familiar with the psychoactive properties of various plants and their appropriate therapeutic applications. Medieval medical practice in England relied heavily on compound remedies containing multiple ingredients, many of which possessed psychoactive properties that contributed to therapeutic effects through mechanisms that medieval physicians understood within humoral frameworks rather than modern pharmacological concepts. Theriac, an elaborate compound medicine that could contain dozens of ingredients, including opium, gained reputation as a universal antidote and general health tonic, commanding high prices that made it accessible primarily to wealthy patients. The preparation of theriac required specialized knowledge and expensive materials, creating markets for expert apothecaries, while ensuring that powerful narcotic compounds remained integrated within complex mixtures rather than being available as purified substances. Medieval hospitals, operated by religious orders, provided medical care that included administration of opium-containing remedies to patients suffering from painful conditions, establishing institutional contexts where narcotic use occurred under medical supervision according to Christian charitable principles. The cultivation of opium poppies in England expanded during the medieval period to meet demands for medicinal opium, with documented production in regions including East Anglia, where soil conditions and climate favoured poppy growth. The domestic opium production reduced English dependence on imported supplies, while creating local expertise in poppy cultivation and opium extraction, establishing traditions that would persist into the early modern period. The medical uses of opium extended beyond pain relief to include treatment of diarrheal diseases, cough suppression, and induction of sleep, making it one of the most versatile and frequently prescribed substances in the medieval pharmacopoeia. The recognition that repeated opium use could lead to habituation and withdrawal symptoms appears in some medieval medical texts, indicating that physicians understood at least empirically that the substance produced physiological dependence, even if they lacked modern neurochemical explanations for these phenomena. Cannabis cultivation for fiber production continued throughout the medieval period, with hemp rope and textiles serving important economic and military functions that ensured systematic farming of the plant across extensive areas of England. The Royal Navy's dependence on hemp rope for rigging created strategic incentives for domestic production, while textile applications provided additional economic motivations for cannabis cultivation. The awareness of cannabis' psychoactive properties likely remained limited compared to knowledge of opium or alcohol effects, as the primary focus on fiber production meant that most contact with the plant involved handling of male plants and processed fibers, rather than consumption of female flowering tops, where psychoactive compounds concentrated. The relatively subtle consciousness-altering effects produced by cannabis ingestion or inhalation particularly when compared to the dramatic effects of opium or tropane-containing plants, may have led to its classification as a minor psychoactive substance unworthy of particular medical or recreational attention. The Black Death's arrival in England during 1348 created unprecedented medical crisis that affected substance use patterns through desperate attempts to find effective treatments, increased opium prescriptions for dying patients experiencing severe suffering, and disruption of normal social controls as mortality rates approached 50% in some regions. The plague's devastating impact on English society created labour shortages that transformed economic relationships and social structures, with corresponding effects on access to and attitudes toward various substances. The increased wages and improved economic positions that surviving labourers achieved in the plague's aftermath created new consumer markets for previously luxury goods, including expensive wines and imported spices, potentially expanding access to psychoactive substances that had formerly been confined to wealthy consumers. The psychological trauma of witnessing mass mortality and social collapse may have influenced attitudes toward intoxication and altered consciousness, though documenting such cultural shifts remains methodologically challenging given the limited and often ambiguous nature of surviving sources. The later medieval period witnessed growing medical interest in distilled spirits, produced through techniques that had reached Western Europe from Islamic sources via Spain and Italy during the 12th and 13th centuries. Early distillation operations in England focused primarily on producing medicines rather than beverages, as the concentrated alcohol obtained through distillation served as a solvent for preparing tinctures and as a preservative for other medicinal compounds. The designation of distilled spirits as aqua vitae, the water of life, reflected beliefs about their health-promoting properties rather than recognition of recreational potential, though the powerful intoxicating effects of concentrated ethanol could not have escaped notice by those who worked with the substance. The gradual transition from viewing distilled spirits primarily as medicines to recognizing their potential as beverages occurred over the 15th and 16th centuries, creating new forms of alcohol consumption that would eventually transform English drinking culture. The dissolution of monasteries ordered by Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 disrupted institutional structures that had preserved medical knowledge and maintained gardens where medicinal plants, including opium poppies, were cultivated. The transfer of monastic properties to secular ownership affected access to medical care for populations that had relied on monastic hospitals, while the dispersal of monastic libraries scattered medical texts that had been concentrated in religious institutions. The establishment of the Church of England created new religious frameworks for understanding intoxication and altered consciousness, as Protestant reformers developed theological positions on substance use that differed in emphasis and detail from Catholic teachings, while maintaining similar concerns about drunkenness and loss of rational self-control. The English Reformation's broader impacts on social organization, cultural practices, and institutional structures created contexts that influenced substance use patterns in ways that proved difficult to isolate from other simultaneous changes affecting English society during this tumultuous period. The expansion of English maritime trade during the 16th century created new access to psychoactive substances from distant regions, particularly tobacco from the Americas and various exotic drugs from Asian sources reached through newly established trade routes. The introduction of tobacco to England during the 1560s initiated a transformation in substance use that would prove more significant than any previous development, as smoking provided a novel method of administration that produced rapid drug delivery to the brain, alongside distinctive social practices and cultural meanings. The initial adoption of tobacco occurred primarily among sailors and maritime workers who had direct contact with the substance during voyages to the Americas, but smoking spread rapidly through English society during the late 16th century, despite high costs that initially limited access to wealthy consumers. The physiological effects of nicotine, including mild stimulation, appetite suppression, and relief of tension, combined with the ritual aspects of pipe smoking to create patterns of use that differed markedly from earlier substance consumption practices based on eating, drinking, or topical application. The debate over tobacco that emerged during the early 17th century revealed competing perspectives on substance use that would recur in later controversies regarding other drugs. As medical practitioners, moral authorities, and government officials offered divergent assessments of smoking's benefits and dangers. King James, the first's famous counterblast to tobacco, published in 1604, condemned smoking in harsh terms that emphasized its foreign origins, offensive smell, health dangers, and associations with vice, establishing royal opposition that would influence but not prevent tobacco's continued spread through English society. Medical writers produced conflicting evaluations of tobacco's therapeutic potential, with some praising it as a valuable medicine for numerous conditions, while others warned about harmful effects on the lungs, brain, and overall constitution. The economic considerations that made tobacco cultivation and trade profitable created incentives for promoting consumption despite health concerns, establishing patterns where commercial interests shaped substance availability and social acceptability in ways that complicated efforts to regulate use based on medical or moral grounds. The establishment of English colonies in North America during the early 17th century created direct access to tobacco supplies and eventually to opium from Turkish sources, reached through Mediterranean trade networks. The Virginia Company's success in developing tobacco as a profitable export crop transformed colonial economics while ensuring abundant supplies of inexpensive tobacco for English consumers, accelerating the spread of smoking across all social classes. The integration of tobacco into English social life proceeded rapidly during the 17th century, with pipes becoming ubiquitous accessories and smoking achieving acceptance in contexts ranging from alley houses to aristocratic salons. The development of tobacco taxation provided government revenue that created fiscal incentives for tolerating and even encouraging consumption, despite ongoing medical debates about health effects, establishing precedents for taxation-based drug policies that would be applied to other substances in later periods. The English Civil War period of 1642 through 1651 disrupted normal social controls and created conditions that affected substance use patterns through breakdown of traditional authority structures, increased stress and trauma among populations experiencing violence and displacement, and shifts in commercial networks that influenced availability of various materials. The military forces that fought in the Civil War consumed substantial quantities of alcohol, with both parliamentarian and royalist armies struggling with drunkenness among soldiers and the disciplinary challenges it created. The medical treatment of wounded soldiers required extensive use of opium as the most effective available analgesic, potentially expanding familiarity with narcotic effects among populations who experienced military medical care or witnessed its application to injured comrades. The political and religious turmoil of the interregnum period influenced attitudes toward intoxication and pleasure-seeking activities, as Puritan authorities implemented strict moral codes that condemned drunkenness and other forms of excess, while royalist opponents embraced such behaviors as forms of cultural resistance against parliamentary rule. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 created permissive social environments at court and among aristocratic circles that encouraged experimentation with various forms of pleasure and sensation, including exploration of substances beyond the traditional English repertoire of alcohol, tobacco, and medical opiates. The scientific revolution that flourished during the later 17th century brought new approaches to understanding how substances affected the body, as natural philosophers conducting experimental investigations began moving beyond humoral theories toward mechanistic explanations of drug actions. The establishment of the Royal Society in 1660 created an institutional framework for systematic investigation of natural phenomena, including the properties of psychoactive plants and chemicals, though the primitive state of chemistry and physiology limited the depth of understanding that could be achieved with available experimental methods. The growing interest in exotic natural products from Asia, Africa, and the Americas brought attention to substances used in other cultures, creating awareness of alternatives to familiar English drugs, even if actual availability remained limited. The coffee houses that proliferated in London and other English cities during the later 17th century introduced a new psychoactive substance that would transform English social life as profoundly as tobacco had done in the previous century. Coffee's stimulant effects, produced by caffeine concentrations substantially higher than those in tea, created experiences of enhanced alertness and mental clarity that appealed particularly to merchants, intellectuals, and professionals whose work required sustained concentration. The coffeehouse environment provided spaces for social interaction, business transactions, political discussion, and information exchange that made these establishments important institutions in English urban life, despite periodic government concerns about their potential as centers for seditious conversation. The rapid adoption of coffee drinking during the 1660s and 1670s demonstrated English society's openness to novel psychoactive substances when they arrived through legitimate commercial channels and became integrated into acceptable social practices. Tea importation from China via East India Company trading operations introduced another caffeinated beverage that would eventually surpass coffee in English popular consumption, though initial adoption proceeded gradually due to high costs that limited tea to wealthy consumers during the 17th century. The development of elaborate tea-drinking rituals among aristocratic and upper-middle-class women created distinctively English cultural practices around tea consumption that differed from Chinese traditions, demonstrating how psychoactive substances acquired locally specific meanings through their integration into particular social contexts. The growing demand for tea during the 18th century created enormous profits for the East India Company, while establishing tea as a defining element of English identity, despite its exotic origins and continuing dependence on Asian sources. The psychoactive effects of tea, milder than coffee due to lower caffeine concentrations and presence of theanine, which modulates stimulant action, produced subtle alterations in consciousness that users valued for promoting social interaction and mental activity without the disruptive effects associated with alcohol intoxication. The gin craze that convulsed English society during the first half of the 18th century represented the most significant crisis in substance use policy that England had yet experienced. As cheap domestically produced spirits became available to working-class populations in quantities that produced widespread drunkenness, social disruption, and moral panic among authorities and social commentators. The removal of restrictions on distilling in 1690, combined with high tariffs on imported spirits, created economic conditions favoring domestic gin production, while corn surpluses made grain alcohol inexpensive to manufacture. The resulting flood of cheap gin onto the market during the 1720s and 1730s produced consumption levels that contemporaries described as epidemic, with particular concerns about drinking among women and the urban poor, who had previously lacked access to strong spirits in such quantities. The famous images by William Hogarth depicting the devastating effects of gin consumption reflected widespread anxieties about social order, moral degradation, and the threat that mass drunkenness posed to economic productivity and political stability. The legislative responses to the gin crisis demonstrated emerging approaches to substance regulation that would influence later drug policies, as Parliament enacted a series of increasingly stringent gin acts between 1729 and 1751, attempting to reduce consumption through taxation, licensing requirements, and criminal penalties. The Gin Act of 1736 imposed such severe restrictions that it proved effectively unenforceable, as the population's resistance to what they viewed as unjust interference with traditional rights to consume alcohol overwhelmed the limited enforcement capabilities available to 18th century government authorities. The more moderate Gin Act of 1751 achieved greater success by combining realistic licensing requirements with community-level enforcement mechanisms, demonstrating that effective substance regulation required public cooperation rather than relying solely on severe penalties. The gradual resolution of the gin crisis during the later 18th century resulted from multiple factors, including improved economic conditions, changing social attitudes toward public drunkenness, and the regulatory framework established through the Gin Acts, creating precedents for addressing substance abuse through combined legal, economic, and cultural approaches. The opium trade that the East India Company developed with China during the 18th century created new sources of supply and changed economic contexts for narcotic distribution in England, though domestic opium consumption remained relatively modest compared to later periods. The cultivation of opium poppies continued in England, particularly in the fens, where marshy conditions proved suitable for poppy growth, supplying local markets while imported Turkish and later Indian opium served larger-scale pharmaceutical manufacturing. The increasing availability of opium during the 18th century coincided with growing medical confidence in prescribing narcotic remedies for a widening range of conditions, as physicians abandoned older restraints based on humoral theories in favor of more liberal therapeutic use of the most effective pain reliever in the pharmacopoeia. The development of patent medicines containing opium created new forms of narcotic distribution that avoided medical gatekeeping, as commercial products marketed with exaggerated therapeutic claims made opiates available to consumers who purchased them directly from apothecaries or general merchants without requiring physician prescriptions. The social patterns of opium use in 18th century England reflected class distinctions and regional variations that would become more pronounced during the 19th century, as wealthier consumers typically obtained opiates through physicians or respectable apothecaries in forms like laudanum, while working-class users more commonly purchased patent medicines or raw opium from local shops. The relatively affordable cost of opium, compared to alcohol, made it an attractive option for poor consumers seeking relief from physical discomfort or temporary escape from harsh living conditions, particularly in regions like the fens, where both local production and traditional use patterns created easy access. The cultural acceptability of opiate use remained high throughout the 18th century, as medical endorsement, lack of obvious social disruption, comparable to alcohol-related disorder, and absence of religious or moral condemnation created permissive environments where narcotic consumption attracted little negative attention. The habit-forming properties of regular opiate use were recognized by medical practitioners and some users who experienced difficulty discontinuing consumption, but this awareness did not generate significant concern about widespread addiction as a social problem requiring policy intervention. The Romantic movement that flourished during the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought new cultural attitudes toward consciousness alteration and subjective experience that influenced how educated English people understood and valued drug-induced states. The emphasis that Romantic poets and philosophers placed on imagination, emotion, and transcendent experience created frameworks that could interpret certain drug effects as enhancements of human capabilities rather than mere intoxications that degraded rational faculties. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's use of laudanum, beginning during the 1790s and continuing throughout his life, exemplified the complex relationship between creative activity and opiate dependence, as the poet attributed some of his most famous works to narcotic-influenced composition, while simultaneously struggling with addiction that undermined his health and productivity. The publication of Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821 provided the first extensive literary account of opiate addiction, describing in vivid detail both the pleasures of narcotic intoxication and the agonies of physical dependence in ways that shaped public understanding of opium's effects for decades. De Quincey's Confessions revealed to English readers the subjective experiences of opiate intoxication with unprecedented detail and literary sophistication, describing the drug's capacity to produce feelings of profound contentment, enhancement of intellectual capabilities, and access to visionary dream states that seemed to offer insights into reality beyond ordinary perception. His account also documented the progression from controlled recreational use to compulsive consumption driven by physical dependence, providing one of the earliest detailed descriptions of addiction as a medical condition rather than simply a moral failing or lack of willpower. The book's commercial success and extensive cultural influence demonstrated the fascination that educated English audiences felt toward altered states of consciousness and the willingness of publishers and readers to engage with frank discussions of drug use when presented in sophisticated literary forms. De Quincey's detailed descriptions of opium withdrawal symptoms, including physical pain, mental anguish, and sleep disturbances, provided medical and popular audiences with information about the physiological consequences of chronic narcotic use that would inform later debates about opiate addiction as a medical problem requiring therapeutic intervention rather than merely moral condemnation. The Industrial Revolution that transformed English society during the late 18th and 19th centuries created new contexts for substance use through urbanization that concentrated populations in cities with different social patterns than rural communities. Factory labor that imposed harsh working conditions and created demands for substances that could sustain productivity or provide relief from exhaustion, and economic changes that affected both the affordability and availability of various psychoactive materials. The migration of rural populations to industrial cities disrupted traditional community structures and social controls that had regulated substance use in village contexts, while the anonymity and social dislocation of urban life created environments where excessive consumption attracted less immediate social sanction. The physical demands of factory work and the rigid time discipline imposed by industrial production created incentives for using stimulants that could maintain energy and alertness during long shifts, while the grim living conditions in working-class urban neighborhoods generated demand for substances that provided temporary escape from harsh realities. The increased money wages that industrial employment provided, despite often declining real living standards, gave working-class populations purchasing power for commercial products, including patent medicines, tobacco, alcohol, and eventually other drugs that became available through expanding retail networks. The expansion of pharmaceutical manufacturing during the early 19th century transformed opiate distribution through development of standardized preparations that could be mass-produced and widely marketed, replacing the more variable compounds prepared individually by local apothecaries. The isolation of morphine from opium by German pharmacist Friedrich Serturner in 1804 created possibilities for more precise dosing and medical applications of opiate's most active constituent, though widespread adoption of purified morphine awaited later improvements in manufacturing processes and injection techniques. The development of other opium alkaloids, including codeine and papaverine, provided additional pharmaceutical options with different therapeutic profiles, expanding the range of medicinal applications while creating multiple forms of narcotic preparations, serving different markets and medical purposes. The patent medicine industry that flourished during the mid-19th century extensively incorporated opiates into products marketed for conditions ranging from infant teething pain to consumption, promoting consumption through advertising that emphasized therapeutic benefits while minimizing or ignoring addiction risks. The introduction of hypodermic injection technology during the 1850s revolutionized drug administration through enabling rapid delivery of concentrated substances directly into the bloodstream, producing faster and more intense effects than oral consumption, while creating new patterns of use and addiction. The invention of the practical hypodermic syringe by Alexander Wood in 1853 and its subsequent refinement and popularization during the following decades made injection technology widely available to medical practitioners, creating enthusiasm for this novel therapeutic tool that seemed to offer superior control over drug effects. The use of morphine injection for pain management during the American Civil War and subsequent conflicts introduced large numbers of people to injectable opiates under medical supervision, with some proportion developing addictions that persisted after their medical treatment concluded. The spread of injection technology beyond professional medical contexts during the later 19th century created opportunities for self-administration that would eventually contribute to new forms of drug use characterized by intensive dosing patterns and rapid development of severe addiction. The importation of cannabis preparations from India during the 19th century introduced British users to concentrated forms of the drug that produced more pronounced psychoactive effects than the hemp that had long been cultivated in England for fiber production. The British colonial presence in India created familiarity with local cannabis use patterns, including consumption of bhang, ganja, and charas, leading some colonial administrators, physicians, and soldiers to adopt these practices and eventually bring knowledge of Indian cannabis preparations back to Britain. William O'Shaughnessy's medical research on cannabis conducted in India during the 1830s and published in British medical journals during the 1840 generated professional interest in the drug's therapeutic potential, leading to its incorporation into the British pharmacopoeia and availability through legitimate medical channels. The medical applications that physicians explored for cannabis included treatment of muscle spasms, pain relief, and appetite stimulation, though the variable potency of available preparations and unpredictable individual responses to the drug limited its clinical usefulness compared to more reliable substances like opiates. The recreational use of cannabis in 19th century England remained relatively limited compared to opiate and alcohol consumption, confined primarily to small bohemian circles, with connections to Orientalist cultural movements and individuals who had direct experience with the drug during colonial service in India or other regions where cannabis use was common. The establishment of hashish clubs in London during the 1860s provided social settings where middle and upper-class experimenters could consume cannabis in group contexts, modeled loosely on Parisian precedents, creating subcultures of drug use that self-consciously positioned themselves as sophisticated alternatives to conventional recreational practices. The literary accounts of cannabis experiences produced by some participants in these circles contributed to cultural associations between the drug and artistic or intellectual activity, establishing tropes that would recur in later periods when cannabis use expanded beyond small elite groups. The relative lack of social problems attributable to cannabis use during this period, combined with its limited popularity, meant that the drug attracted little attention from authorities concerned primarily with the more visible issues created by alcohol and opiate consumption. The extent of opiate addiction in Victorian England became increasingly apparent during the mid-19th century, as medical practitioners, social reformers, and government officials began recognizing patterns of chronic use that caused health problems and social difficulties, distinct from the acute intoxication associated with alcohol. The term addiction itself evolved during this period from earlier meanings related to devotion or commitment toward its modern sense of compulsive substance use driven by physiological dependence, reflecting growing awareness that regular narcotic consumption created biological changes, making cessation extremely difficult. The medical community's understanding of addiction progressed from viewing it primarily as a moral weakness or failure of self-control toward recognition of physiological mechanisms underlying compulsive use, though moral judgments continued to influence both professional and popular attitudes toward addicted individuals. The development of medical specialization in addiction treatment created new professional roles and institutional structures, including inebriate asylums that provided residential care for individuals unable to overcome dependencies through willpower alone, establishing precedents for medical rather than purely criminal approaches to problematic substance use. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 represented the first significant British legislation restricting access to drugs, requiring that opiate-containing preparations be sold only by registered pharmacists and establishing limited record-keeping requirements for narcotic sales. The legislation reflected growing concerns about accidental poisonings, particularly among children, deaths from overdoses, both accidental and intentional, and the extent of habitual opiate use among the population. Though the Act's provisions remained relatively modest by later standards, the pharmacy profession's resistance to more stringent regulations that might restrict their commercial activities limited the Act's scope, while the absence of prescription requirements for most opiate preparations meant that customers could still purchase narcotics directly from pharmacists without medical authorization. The Pharmacy Act established principles of specialized retail distribution and professional oversight that would be expanded in subsequent legislation, creating frameworks for drug control that balanced legitimate medical and commercial interests against growing concerns about misuse and addiction. The temperance movement that gained strength during the Victorian period focused primarily on alcohol rather than other drugs, but its campaigns influenced broader attitudes toward intoxication and self-control that affected perceptions of all psychoactive substance use. The movement's emphasis on the moral and social harms caused by drunkenness created cultural contexts that increasingly viewed intoxication as problematic rather than acceptable, applying standards of sobriety and self-discipline that extended beyond alcohol to encompass drug use more generally. The success of temperance advocates in building popular support for restrictions on alcohol sales demonstrated the potential for moral reform movements to influence substance policy, providing models for later anti-drug campaigns. The complex relationship between temperance, advocacy, and opiate use created situations where some reformers who condemned alcohol consumption made regular use of laudanum or other narcotic preparations, reflecting distinctions between different classes of drugs and the social contexts of their use that shaped Victorian attitudes towards substance policy. The adulteration of food and drugs that characterized much commercial production during the mid-19th century created public health problems that extended to opiate preparations, as manufacturers frequently substituted cheaper substances for advertised ingredients or manipulated alkaloid concentrations in ways that made dosing unpredictable and dangerous. The lack of regulatory oversight meant that consumers had little reliable information about the actual contents or potency of products they purchased, creating risks of both ineffective treatment when substances were heavily diluted and accidental overdoses when preparations proved stronger than expected. The campaigns for pure food and drug legislation that developed during the later Victorian period addressed these problems through advocating for regulatory standards that would ensure accurate labeling and consistent product quality, establishing principles of consumer protection that complemented the pharmacy profession's gatekeeping role. The Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 established requirements for accurate labeling and prohibited some forms of adulteration, though enforcement remained limited, and the Act's provisions did not specifically address the most dangerous aspects of unregulated narcotic distribution. The increasing international trade in narcotic drugs during the late 19th century created global markets that connected opium production in India and other Asian regions with pharmaceutical manufacturing in Europe and North America, while also supplying opium smoking establishments that proliferated in port cities serving Chinese immigrant communities. The British role in the opium trade with China, which had expanded dramatically during the 19th century, despite Chinese government opposition, and eventually triggered the Opium Wars of 1839 through 1842 and 1856 through 1860, created ethical controversies that influenced domestic attitudes toward narcotic commerce. The recognition that British commercial and strategic interests promoted opium consumption in China for profit, while simultaneously expressing concerns about domestic addiction, created contradictions that critics highlighted in challenging both the opium trade and the broader imperial system that supported it. The Chinese populations that migrated to England during the later 19th century brought their own opium smoking traditions, establishing establishments in port areas of London and other cities that became subjects of sensationalized media coverage, emphasizing exotic and allegedly degrading aspects of narcotic consumption in these contexts. The emergence of cocaine as a significant drug of use during the 1880s followed its isolation from coca leaves and the enthusiasm that medical professionals and the public displayed for what initially appeared to be a remarkably beneficial stimulant without significant drawbacks. The Peruvian coca leaves from which cocaine derived had been used by indigenous populations for centuries to combat fatigue and hunger at high altitudes. But the concentrated alkaloid extracted through 19th century chemistry possessed far more potent effects and addiction potential than traditional coca preparations. Sigmund Freud's early publications promoting cocaine as a treatment for morphine addiction and a general tonic represented the medical establishment's initial optimism about the drug, while commercial products incorporating cocaine, including the original Coca-Cola formula, introduced the stimulant to mass consumer markets. The subsequent recognition that cocaine produced severe psychological dependence and serious health consequences, including cardiovascular problems and psychotic reactions, created the first major instance of initially celebrated drug being reconsidered as dangerous, establishing patterns of enthusiasm followed by backlash that would recur with other substances. The availability of cocaine through legitimate pharmaceutical channels during the late 19th century created patterns of use that ranged from medical applications for local anesthesia to recreational consumption by fashionable society members seeking the drug's stimulant and euphoric effects. The development of cocaine hydrochloride suitable for injection, created particularly dangerous forms of use, characterized by rapid addiction development and severe health consequences, including the paranoid psychosis that came to be, recognized as a specific syndrome associated with chronic cocaine use. The relatively high cost of pharmaceutical cocaine limited its use primarily to middle and upper-class consumers during this period, creating class dimensions to cocaine use patterns that differed from the more socially diverse populations consuming opiates. The growing recognition of cocaine's dangers during the 1890s led to increasing regulatory attention and declining medical enthusiasm for a drug that had briefly appeared to offer remarkable therapeutic potential. The Pharmacy Act of 1898 expanded earlier regulations by requiring that cocaine be sold only by registered pharmacists and limiting sales to professional medical purposes, reflecting the evolving understanding of the drug's addiction potential and dangers. The legislation represented gradual movement toward more stringent drug controls, while maintaining the principle that legitimate medical use should remain possible under appropriate professional supervision. The enforcement of these regulations remained limited by the small number of inspectors and the difficulty of monitoring thousands of pharmacies throughout the country, allowing considerable latitude for continued availability of narcotics through commercial channels. The social problems attributed to cocaine and opiate use during the late Victorian period remained relatively modest compared to alcohol-related issues, limiting the political pressure for more comprehensive drug regulation despite growing recognition of addiction as a medical and social problem. The turn of the 20th century brought new scientific understanding of addiction through neurological research and pharmacological studies that began elucidating the biological mechanisms underlying compulsive drug use, moving beyond older frameworks that attributed addiction primarily to moral weakness or character defects. The development of experimental psychology and physiology created research methodologies for systematic investigation of drug effects on behavior and bodily functions, providing empirical foundations for medical knowledge that previously had depended primarily on clinical observation. The growing medical consensus that addiction represented a disease requiring treatment rather than simply a vice, deserving punishment, created support for therapeutic approaches to managing drug dependence, though punitive attitudes remained influential in shaping policy responses to problematic substance use. The establishment of the medical profession's authority over questions of drug policy through their expertise in pharmacology and treatment created gatekeeping roles that would prove crucial in subsequent regulatory developments. The international movement toward drug control that emerged during the early 20th century reflected concerns about opium use in Asian countries, where European colonial powers had promoted narcotic commerce, along with growing awareness of addiction problems in Europe and North America. The International Opium Commission, that met in Shanghai in 1909, brought together representatives from 13 nations to discuss opium problems, creating momentum for international cooperation on drug control that would eventually produce treaty obligations influencing domestic policies. The Hague Convention of 1912 established the first international drug control treaty, requiring signatories to enact domestic legislation regulating opium, morphine, cocaine, and their derivatives, creating external pressures for British policy changes. The ratification of the Hague Convention required Parliament to pass implementing legislation, setting the stage for dramatic transformations in British drug policy during the 1920s. The Defence of the Realm Act, passed in 1914, as emergency wartime legislation, included provisions restricting cocaine and opiate distribution, reflecting concerns that drug use might undermine military effectiveness and civilian morale during the national crisis. The Act's drug control provisions, initially intended as temporary wartime measures, established regulatory frameworks that would be extended and made permanent in subsequent legislation. The restriction of narcotic access to prescriptions from licensed medical practitioners represented a fundamental shift from the relatively open availability that had characterized the 19th century, creating the modern system of medical gatekeeping for controlled substances. The cocaine panic that developed during the First World War, fueled by sensationalized media reports about drug use by soldiers and working-class women, generated public support for stringent controls, despite limited evidence that cocaine use actually posed significant problems. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 implemented Britain's obligations under international drug treaties while establishing comprehensive domestic regulatory frameworks for narcotic control. The Act required registration of individuals possessing or distributing opiates and cocaine, restricted legal access to prescriptions from authorized medical practitioners, and created criminal penalties for unauthorized possession or distribution. The legislation represented a watershed moment in British drug policy, transforming the legal status of substances that had been freely available for centuries and creating the basic structure of controls that would govern narcotic regulation throughout the 20th century. The Home Office's role in administering the dangerous drugs regulations established bureaucratic structures for drug control that would expand considerably in subsequent decades. The British system that developed during the 1920s for managing opiate addiction differed from the more punitive approaches adopted in the United States, maintaining the principle that addiction represented a medical condition requiring treatment under physician supervision. The Rolleston Committee report of 1926 affirmed that physicians could legitimately prescribe opiates to addicted patients indefinitely if medical judgment determined that maintenance treatment served the patient's interests better than enforced abstinence. This policy, which came to be known internationally as the British system, created a middle ground between completely prohibiting access to narcotics and allowing unrestricted distribution, recognizing addiction's medical dimensions while maintaining control over legal drug supplies. The relatively small scale of addiction problems in Britain during this period, with perhaps a few thousand dependent individuals, made maintenance prescribing administratively feasible in ways that might have proved impossible with larger affected populations. The interwar period witnessed growing international collaboration on drug control through the League of Nations, which established permanent administrative structures for monitoring national compliance with treaty obligations and coordinating international efforts against illicit trafficking. The British government's participation in these international initiatives reflected commitment to drug control principles, while attempting to protect legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing and trade that generated economic benefits. The distinction between medical and non-medical drug use became increasingly central to regulatory frameworks, creating categories that defined legitimate applications requiring continued availability while prohibiting recreational consumption viewed as harmful and socially unacceptable. The evolution of medical ethics regarding narcotic prescribing created professional standards that most physicians followed in determining when maintenance prescribing was appropriate, generally limiting such treatment to cases where addiction had developed through medical use or where individuals appeared unable to achieve abstinence through other means. The Second World War created disruptions in drug distribution networks that affected both licit pharmaceutical supplies and illicit trafficking, while military demands for morphine and other analgesics ensured continued production priorities for medical applications. The wartime emergency powers expanded government authority over numerous aspects of civilian life, including enhanced control over pharmaceutical distribution and medical practice, establishing precedents for state intervention that would influence post-war policy development. The relatively modest scale of recreational drug use during this period meant that psychoactive substances, other than alcohol and tobacco, attracted limited public attention, allowing drug control to remain primarily an administrative matter handled through medical and pharmaceutical regulation, rather than becoming a major political issue. The post-war decades brought significant social changes that would eventually transform British drug use patterns, though the immediate aftermath of 1945 saw continuation of the relatively stable situation that had characterized earlier periods. The formation of the National Health Service in 1948 created new frameworks for medical practice that affected drug prescribing through establishing state responsibility for healthcare provision and creating bureaucratic oversight of medical treatment decisions. The NHS's role in managing addiction treatment meant that maintenance prescribing occurred within a public health system rather than private practice, potentially offering greater standardization and oversight, while ensuring that economic barriers did not prevent access to treatment. The relatively small number of known addicts in Britain during the 1950s, estimated at perhaps fewer than 500 individuals, received treatment primarily through a small number of specialists who developed expertise in maintenance prescribing under the British system. The emergence of a new drug culture during the 1960s marked a dramatic departure from previous patterns, as cannabis and amphetamines became popular among youth populations seeking recreational experiences rather than medical benefits. The importation of cannabis by West Indian immigrants who had used the drug in the Caribbean introduced marijuana to British subcultures, where it became associated with music scenes and countercultural movements rejecting mainstream social values. The spread of cannabis use beyond immigrant communities to native British youth during the mid-1960s created the first significant population of recreational drug users, whose substance choices were driven primarily by pleasure-seeking and cultural identification rather than addiction or medical need. The association of cannabis with emerging youth culture, including popular music, fashion, and political attitudes, created moral panics among authorities concerned about challenges to traditional values and social order. The amphetamine use that proliferated during the 1960s originated partly from prescriptions for weight loss and depression treatment that physicians had been writing with increasing frequency during the 1950s, creating large quantities of pharmaceutical stimulants that were diverted to recreational use. The energy and euphoria produced by amphetamines made them popular in music and club scenes, where users valued the drug's abilities to sustain dancing and social interaction through long nights. The development of methamphetamine, a more potent stimulant than earlier amphetamine preparations, created substances with greater addiction potential and more severe health consequences, including psychotic reactions and cardiovascular problems. The injection of amphetamines that became common among some user populations during the later 1960s created particularly dangerous patterns of use, characterized by rapid addiction development and serious medical complications. The growth of heroin use during the 1960s challenged the British system's foundations, as increasing numbers of young recreational users, without medical reasons for opiate use, sought drugs from physicians willing to prescribe large quantities of heroin with minimal oversight. The small number of doctors who prescribed substantial quantities of heroin to growing patient populations created situations where prescribed drugs were diverted to illicit markets, undermining the distinction between medical and non-medical use that had justified maintenance prescribing. The Brain Committee's second report in 1965 recommended restricting heroin, prescribing to specially licensed physicians, and establishing specialized treatment clinics, representing recognition that the British system required modification to address changing patterns of addiction. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1967 implemented these recommendations, creating the clinic system that would characterize British addiction treatment for subsequent decades, while ending the era when any physician could prescribe heroin to addicted patients. The drug treatment clinics established during the late 1960s attempted to manage growing heroin addiction through controlled prescribing, combined with counseling and support services. Though the effectiveness of this approach remained controversial, the clinic's policies varied considerably regarding willingness to provide maintenance prescriptions versus emphasizing abstinence-oriented treatment, creating inconsistencies in how different facilities responded to comparable patients. The development of methadone maintenance as an alternative to heroin prescribing offered a treatment approach that could prevent withdrawal symptoms and reduce craving while using a longer-acting opiate less suitable for injection. Though some advocates argued that heroin maintenance better served certain patients' needs. The evolution of British addiction treatment during the 1970s increasingly emphasized abstinence as the appropriate goal rather than indefinite maintenance, representing a shift from earlier British system principles toward approaches more similar to abstinence-oriented models, predominant in other countries. The Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971 established the comprehensive legal framework that continues to govern British drug policy, replacing earlier legislation with a system that classified substances according to assessed harm potential and established corresponding penalties for unauthorized possession and distribution. The Act created 3 schedules of controlled drugs, with Class A, including substances like heroin, cocaine, and LSD, considered most dangerous, Class B, encompassing amphetamines and cannabis, and Class C containing various prescription drugs with abuse potential. The maximum penalties established for different offenses ranged from 7 years imprisonment for Class C possession to life imprisonment for Class A trafficking, creating substantial criminal sanctions intended to deter drug use and distribution. The Act's passage reflected growing concern about drug use among young people and belief that stricter criminal penalties might reduce drug availability and discourage experimentation. The expansion of cannabis use during the 1970s made marijuana Britain's most widely used illicit drug, consumed by substantial minorities of youth populations, particularly in urban areas, and associated with countercultural movements. The debate over cannabis policy intensified as critics argued that criminal penalties for possession seemed disproportionate to the drug's actual harms, while supporters of strict enforcement maintained that permissive approaches would lead to increased use and progression to more dangerous drugs. The scientific evidence regarding cannabis harms remained contested, with some studies suggesting relatively modest health risks, while others pointed to potential psychological problems and the drug's possible role as a gateway to harder substances. The cultural associations of cannabis with youth rebellion and alternative lifestyles made the drug symbolically significant beyond its pharmacological properties, representing broader conflicts over social values and acceptable behavior. The heroin epidemic that emerged during the 1980s marked a dramatic escalation in British drug problems, as opiate use spread beyond the relatively small populations that had characterized earlier decades to affect substantially larger and more socially diverse groups. The increased availability of heroin through international trafficking networks created access to the drug in communities where it had previously been rare or unknown, while economic changes that devastated traditional industries in northern England and Scotland created populations of unemployed youth vulnerable to drug involvement. The association of heroin use with crime, particularly theft, to fund drug purchases, generated public concerns about both the direct harms of addiction and the secondary problems created by drug-related criminal activity. The spread of HIV infection through sharing of injection equipment created urgent public health crises that required responses balancing disease prevention against continued emphasis on drug abstinence, leading to harm reduction approaches, including needle exchange programs that some critics viewed as condoning drug use. The crack cocaine that appeared in British cities during the late 1980s introduced a new form of stimulant use that proved even more problematic than powder cocaine snorting, as smoking crack produced intense but brief euphoria that encouraged compulsive use patterns and rapid addiction development. The concentration of crack use in disadvantaged urban neighborhoods created associations between the drug and social deprivation, while generating concerns about crack houses and street dealing that contributed to neighborhood decay. The violence that sometimes accompanied crack distribution, along with the drug's association with other criminal activity, made crack cocaine a focus of intensive law enforcement efforts, employing strategies ranging from street-level arrests to sophisticated investigations of trafficking organizations. The recognition that crack addiction proved extremely difficult to treat through existing therapeutic approaches created pessimism about possibilities for helping dependent users achieve recovery, though some treatment programs eventually developed more effective methods for managing crack addiction. The rave culture that emerged during the late 1980s brought ecstasy into widespread use among young people, seeking enhanced experiences in dance clubs and outdoor parties featuring electronic music. The empathogenic effects of MDMA, which promoted feelings of emotional closeness, enhanced sensory perception, and increased energy, made ecstasy particularly suited to social contexts, where users valued the drug's abilities to facilitate interpersonal connection and physical endurance. The deaths of several young people from hypothermia and other complications of ecstasy use during the early 1990s generated moral panics and demands for strict enforcement against both drug distribution and the venues where consumption occurred. The debates over appropriate policy responses to ecstasy revealed tensions between public health approaches, emphasizing user education and harm reduction versus law enforcement strategies focused on disruption of drug supplies, punishment of users and dealers. The Criminal Justice Act of 1994 expanded police powers for addressing rave culture through provisions, allowing seizure of sound equipment and prohibition of outdoor gatherings where music characterized by repetitive beats was played, representing controversial expansions of state authority justified by drug control objectives. The legislation reflected broader, tough, on-crime political trends during the 1990s, as both Conservative and Labour parties competed to demonstrate commitment to law enforcement approaches to social problems. The practical effectiveness of intensive enforcement against raves remained limited, as the culture adapted to police pressure through shifting to less visible venues while maintaining drug use patterns. The eventual accommodation between authorities and commercial dance clubs that provided controlled environments for what had originated as countercultural activities demonstrated how initially prohibited cultural practices could become accepted when integrated into regulated commercial contexts. The new Labour government that came to power in 1997 maintained previous administration's emphasis on criminal justice approaches, while introducing new initiatives intended to reduce drug-related crime through treatment and testing requirements. The drug treatment and testing orders established in 1998 created mechanisms for courts to mandate treatment as an alternative to incarceration for some drug-involved offenders, representing recognition that criminal justice responses alone could not adequately address addiction. The expansion of methadone maintenance programs during this period reflected growing acceptance of substitution therapy as an effective approach to managing opiate dependence, though debates continued about appropriate roles for abstinence-oriented treatment versus indefinite maintenance. The establishment of the National Treatment Agency in 2001 created centralized oversight of drug treatment services, attempting to ensure consistent quality and evidence-based practices across the country. The reclassification of cannabis from Class B to Class C status in 2004 reflected assessments that the drug's harms did not warrant the same legal status as substances like amphetamines, creating more proportionate penalties that focused enforcement resources on dealers rather than users. The decision proved controversial, with critics arguing that downgrading sent wrong messages about cannabis safety, while supporters maintained that the change brought law more into alignment with scientific evidence regarding relative harms. The subsequent reversal of this decision in 2009, returning cannabis to Class B status, demonstrated the political sensitivity surrounding drug classification and the difficulty of maintaining policy positions based primarily on scientific assessments of harm when public opinion and political pressures pushed towards stricter controls. The debates over cannabis classification revealed broader tensions in British drug policy between evidence-based approaches and political considerations. The emergence of novel psychoactive substances during the 2010s created new challenges for drug control frameworks designed for traditional substances with known chemical structures, as manufacturers produce synthetic compounds with effects similar to controlled drugs, but molecular structures, allowing them to evade existing regulations. The availability of these legal highs through retail outlets and internet vendors created situations where young people could purchase psychoactive substances without engaging with illegal markets, complicating enforcement while raising concerns about harms from inadequately tested compounds. The Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016 attempted to address this problem through blanket prohibition of substances intended for human consumption that produce psychoactive effects, shifting from listing specific banned chemicals to prohibiting entire categories based on effects rather than structures. The legislation's broad scope created controversies regarding its potential impacts on legitimate research and commercial products, while its enforcement proved challenging given the continuing development of new synthetic compounds. The opioid crisis that devastated the United States during the 2010s affected Britain more modestly due to differences in medical prescribing practices and pharmaceutical marketing regulations that prevented the aggressive promotion of prescription painkillers that had contributed to American epidemic conditions. The relatively cautious approach that British physicians took to prescribing opioids for chronic pain reflected both professional culture and regulatory oversight that discouraged the casual dispensing of powerful narcotics. The recognition of prescription drug diversion and addiction as problems requiring policy attention led to enhanced monitoring systems and prescribing guidelines intended to reduce inappropriate opioid prescriptions while ensuring that patients with legitimate pain conditions retained access to effective treatment. The development of drug-related death surveillance systems provided better data on overdose fatalities, revealing that deaths involving opiates, particularly in combination with other substances, represented serious public health problems, despite the absence of American-scale epidemic conditions. The cocaine use that resurged during the 2010s involved both powder cocaine and crack, with some evidence suggesting increased consumption among middle-class professionals, alongside the continued concentration of crack use in disadvantaged communities. The availability of high-purity cocaine at relatively affordable prices made the drug accessible to broader populations than during earlier periods, when cost and limited availability restricted use primarily to wealthy consumers. The normalization of cocaine use in some social contexts, where taking the drug became an unremarkable aspect of nightlife and social activities, contrasted sharply with the stigmatization of crack users and demonstrated how substances' social meanings depended heavily on patterns of use and user populations, rather than solely on pharmacological properties. The persistence of substantial cocaine markets, despite decades of enforcement efforts, raised questions about the effectiveness of supply-side interdiction strategies that attempted to reduce availability through disrupting trafficking, organizations, and seizing shipments. The contemporary British drug landscape reflects the accumulated impacts of policies, cultural changes, and pharmacological developments spanning over a century of regulation and prohibition. The criminal justice emphasis that has characterized official approaches since the 1970s coexists uneasily with public health frameworks that view addiction as a medical condition requiring treatment rather than punishment, creating tensions between different institutional responses to drug use. The significant resources devoted to enforcement, including police operations, prosecutions, and imprisonment, have not prevented the continued availability of illicit drugs or eliminated user populations, raising questions about the cost-effectiveness and appropriateness of prohibition-based policies. The harm reduction approaches that have gained acceptance since the AIDS crisis, including needle exchanges, supervised consumption facilities, and naloxone distribution, represent pragmatic acknowledgements that enforcement and treatment cannot eliminate drug use, and that minimizing adverse consequences deserves policy priority, even when abstinence remains unachievable for many users. The ongoing debates over drug policy reform reflect diverse perspectives on appropriate governmental responses to substance use, ranging from maintaining current prohibitions to partial decriminalization of possession for personal use, comprehensive legalization and regulation. The evidence from jurisdictions that have implemented less punitive approaches, including Portugal's decriminalization policy and various American states' cannabis legalization, suggests that alternative frameworks might achieve better outcomes in terms of both public health and criminal justice impacts. The political obstacles to major policy reform in Britain remain substantial, as concerns about sending wrong messages, particularly to young people, and anxieties about potential increases in use, continue to generate resistance to fundamental changes in drug control approaches. The economic interests that benefit from continued prohibition, including elements of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, create institutional biases against reforms that might reduce drug-related enforcement activities, their associated budgets. The scientific understanding of addiction has advanced dramatically since the early decades, when drug use first became subject to regulation, revealing complex neurobiological mechanisms underlying compulsive use and providing foundations for more effective treatments. The recognition that addiction involves alterations in brain reward circuitry, decision-making processes, and stress responses has moved medical understanding far beyond older frameworks that attributed drug dependence primarily to moral failings or weak character. The development of evidence-based treatments, including both behavioral interventions and pharmacological approaches, has improved outcomes for many individuals seeking to overcome dependencies. Though significant proportions of addicted people continue to experience chronic relapsing conditions, requiring ongoing support, the stigmatization of drug users that remains pervasive in British society creates barriers to treatment seeking and social reintegration, undermining recovery efforts while causing broader harms to individuals who face discrimination in employment, housing, and other domains due to their substance use histories. The role of social determinants in shaping drug use patterns has become increasingly recognized, as research demonstrates strong associations between substance problems and factors including poverty, adverse childhood experiences, trauma exposure, and social isolation. The concentration of problematic drug use in disadvantaged communities reflects these underlying social factors, rather than suggesting that drugs themselves create social problems independent of context. The implications of this understanding for drug policy suggest that effective responses to substance issues require addressing the social conditions that make drug use appealing or necessary for some individuals, complementing direct interventions focused on drug availability and user behavior, with broader efforts to reduce social inequalities and improve life circumstances in affected communities. The political challenges of implementing such comprehensive approaches remain formidable, given competing demands on public resources and the difficulty of demonstrating direct causal links between social programs and reduced drug problems. The continuing evolution of drug markets through online distribution platforms and cryptocurrency transactions creates new challenges for enforcement, while potentially offering safer purchasing conditions for users who can avoid the risks of street drug transactions. The dark web marketplaces that emerged during the early 2010s initially promised anonymous transactions and quality-controlled products that might reduce harms associated with unpredictable street drug purities. Adulteration. The law enforcement responses to these platforms, including major site shutdowns and arrests of operators, have temporarily disrupted, but not eliminated, online drug markets, which have demonstrated resilience through rapid reconstitution under new management. The tension between enforcement capabilities and market adaptations suggests that technological approaches to drug distribution will continue to develop regardless of prohibitions, requiring policy responses that acknowledge this reality rather than relying exclusively on supply interdiction strategies that prove increasingly difficult to implement effectively. The legalization of cannabis in various North American jurisdictions has created practical experiments in regulated markets whose outcomes will likely influence British policy debates in coming years, as evidence accumulates regarding the impacts of different regulatory approaches. The early data from states like Colorado and Washington suggests that legalization can be implemented without catastrophic increases in use, while generating tax revenues and reducing criminal justice costs, though questions remain about optimal regulatory structures and long-term consequences. The Canadian experience with nationwide legalization, beginning in 2018, provides additional evidence about how regulatory systems function at larger scales, including challenges of preventing illicit market persistence and managing issues like impaired driving and youth access. The British government's continuing opposition to cannabis legalization, despite these international developments, reflects both principled policy positions and political calculations about public opinion and international treaty obligations that constrain national policy options. The future trajectory of British drug policy will depend on complex interactions between scientific evidence, political pressures, economic considerations, and cultural attitudes that shape what approaches appear feasible and desirable to different constituencies. The possibility exists for continuation of current prohibition-based frameworks, with incremental modifications to address specific problems, maintaining the fundamental structure that has governed British drug control since the early 20th century. Alternative scenarios include substantial policy reforms, ranging from decriminalisation of personal possession to comprehensive legalisation and regulation of currently prohibited substances, representing dramatic departures from existing approaches based on different assessments of prohibition's costs and benefits. The international dimensions of drug policy create both constraints and opportunities for British policy development, as international treaties establish baselines for drug control, while the diversity of national approaches demonstrates the flexibility available within treaty frameworks for implementing varied policies. The contemporary British drug situation reflects the accumulated legacy of over a century of prohibition, medical gatekeeping, and enforcement efforts that have shaped, but not eliminated, patterns of psychoactive substance use that have characterized English society throughout its history. The psychoactive plants that ancient Celtic populations incorporated into religious rituals, the opium that Victorian physicians prescribed for diverse ailments, the cocaine that briefly appeared as a wonder drug before recognition of its dangers, the cannabis that became symbolic of countercultural movements, and the synthetic compounds that continue to emerge from clandestine laboratories all represent human desires for altered consciousness that predate and persist despite prohibitions and controls. The recognition that substance use serves diverse human needs, ranging from medical treatment to recreational pleasure to self-medication for psychological distress, suggests that policies premised on eliminating all non-medical use face inherent obstacles in achieving their objectives. The challenge for contemporary policymakers involves developing frameworks that acknowledge the realities of substance use while minimizing individual and social harms through evidence-based interventions that balance public health and individual liberty. The enduring presence of psychoactive substances in English society, despite centuries of changing attitudes and decades of intensive prohibition, demonstrates the persistence of human relationships with consciousness-altering materials that fulfill needs and desires that legal sanctions cannot eliminate. The specific substances that dominate use patterns change over time in response to availability, cultural meanings, legal status, and other factors. But the basic human propensity for seeking altered states through chemical means remains constant across historical periods. The policy question that emerges from this recognition involves not whether such substance use will occur, but rather how societies can best manage the inevitable presence of psychoactive drugs to minimize harms while respecting individual autonomy and avoiding counterproductive consequences of overly punitive approaches. The British experience with drug regulation, spanning from complete legal availability through medical gatekeeping to criminal prohibition, offers lessons about the possibilities and limitations of different policy frameworks that may inform future efforts to develop more effective and humane approaches to managing humanity's enduring relationship with psychoactive substances. The medicinal applications of psychoactive substances in medieval England extended far beyond simple pain relief to encompass complex understandings of how different preparations affected the body's humoral balance and treated specific disease conditions, according to Galenic medical theories that dominated European practice throughout the period. The opium-based remedies that physicians prescribed included not only simple laudanum preparations, but elaborate compound medicines, combining multiple ingredients according to formulas passed down from classical sources and modified betig through centuries of practical experience. The theriac preparations that wealthy patients could afford contained dozens of components, including opium, various herbs, exotic spices, and sometimes ingredients like viper flesh that medieval medical theory considered essential for the compound's efficacy. The preparation of these complex medicines required specialized knowledge and expensive materials, creating hierarchies within medical practice, where elite physicians treating aristocratic patients prescribed elaborate compounds, while simpler practitioners, serving common people, relied on more basic remedies using locally available ingredients. The cultivation techniques for medicinal plants in medieval monastery gardens reflected sophisticated botanical knowledge that monks accumulated through careful observation and systematic record-keeping spanning generations. The selection of optimal planting locations considering soil conditions, sunlight exposure, and water availability demonstrated practical understanding of how environmental factors affected plant growth and potency. The timing of harvests to coincide with specific lunar phases or seasonal conditions reflected beliefs about how cosmic influences affected the concentration of active principles in medicinal plants, creating ritualized practices that combined empirical observation with astrological frameworks. The processing methods used to preserve and concentrate medicinal plant materials included drying, fermentation, distillation, and extraction techniques that required considerable skill to execute properly, while maintaining the therapeutic properties that made plants valuable for medical applications. The social organization of medieval medical practice created distinct roles for physicians, apothecaries, and herbalists who occupied different positions within healthcare hierarchies and served different patient populations. The university-trained physicians, who treated wealthy patients, possessed theoretical knowledge derived from classical texts and commanded high fees for consultations that involved diagnosis through examination of urine and other bodily signs, followed by prescription of appropriate remedies. The apothecaries who prepared and sold medicines operated shops in urban areas where they combined imported exotic drugs with local ingredients to create remedies according to physicians' prescriptions or their own formulas for customers who sought treatment without consulting expensive doctors. The herbalists and wise women who served rural populations and urban poor relied primarily on locally gathered plants and traditional knowledge passed through oral transmission rather than book learning, creating parallel medical systems that coexisted with official medicine, while sometimes facing accusations of witchcraft when their treatments involved substances associated with magic. The development of hospitals during the medieval period created institutional contexts for administering powerful medicines, including opiates, to patients suffering from serious injuries or diseases requiring intensive care. The religious orders that operated these charitable institutions viewed medical treatment as an expression of Christian compassion for the suffering, integrating healthcare with spiritual care in ways that shaped how medicines were understood and administered. The hospital gardens where medicinal plants were cultivated provided fresh materials for preparing remedies, while also serving contemplative and educational purposes for the monks and nuns who maintained them. The record-keeping practices that some hospitals employed created documentation of treatment outcomes that could inform future medical decisions, establishing early forms of clinical observation that would eventually contribute to more systematic approaches to evaluating therapeutic interventions. The trade networks that supplied medieval England with exotic drugs and spices created commercial relationships, connecting English merchants with suppliers in the Mediterranean, Middle East, and eventually Asia as maritime exploration expanded European access to distant markets. The opium that arrived from Turkey and Egypt through Venetian and other Italian intermediaries commanded high prices, reflecting the costs of long-distance transportation and the risks of maritime commerce during this period. The spices that European merchants imported from Asian sources included some with mild psychoactive properties alongside their culinary applications, introducing English consumers to substances like nutmeg, which could produce hallucinogenic effects when consumed in large quantities. The economic importance of drug and spice trade created powerful commercial interests that would eventually drive European colonial expansion, as merchants and governments sought direct access to Asian production regions to eliminate intermediary costs and increase profit margins. The Black Death's demographic impact transformed English society's relationship with medicinal substances through creating acute labor shortages that empowered surviving workers to demand higher wages and improved conditions, while simultaneously disrupting traditional social hierarchies and creating new patterns of consumption. The psychological trauma of witnessing mass mortality on unprecedented scale influenced cultural attitudes toward death, suffering, and the value of measures that could provide comfort during terminal illness, even if they could not prevent death itself. The increased use of opiate pain relievers for plague victims who suffered excruciating symptoms reflected both medical desperation in the face of an untreatable disease and recognition that alleviating suffering represented an important therapeutic goal when cure proved impossible. The social disruption caused by the plague's recurring outbreaks throughout the 14th and 15th centuries created periods when normal regulatory mechanisms broke down, potentially allowing increased experimentation with various substances as traditional authorities struggled to maintain order amid demographic catastrophe. The gradual recovery of European population during the 15th century created growing markets for luxury goods, including exotic drugs and spices that had become more accessible to middle-class consumers as economic conditions improved. The expansion of trade networks through improved maritime technology and commercial organization increased the volume and variety of substances reaching English markets, while reducing costs through competition and economies of scale. The development of more sophisticated banking and credit systems facilitated long-distance trade by reducing the need to transport large quantities of precious metals for purchases, making commercial operations more efficient and less risky. The accumulation of capital among merchant classes created new concentrations of wealth that supported consumption of expensive substances, while also providing resources for investing in exploration and colonial ventures that would dramatically expand European access to psychoactive materials. The Protestant Reformation's impact on English medical practice operated through multiple mechanisms, including the dissolution of monasteries that had preserved medical knowledge and maintained healing institutions, changing attitudes towards suffering and its religious meaning, and new emphases on individual conscience and direct relationship with God that influenced how people understood the morality of using substances to alter consciousness or relieve pain. The loss of monastic hospitals disrupted healthcare provision for poor populations who had relied on charitable medical care, creating gaps in service that secular authorities and private physicians could not immediately fill. The dispersal of monastic medical libraries scattered texts and disrupted chains of knowledge transmission that had operated through institutional continuity, though some materials were preserved by collectors and eventually found their way into new institutional settings. The theological debates about predestination and salvation that characterized Protestant thought created new frameworks for understanding suffering's religious significance, with some Reformed traditions viewing pain as divinely ordained, testing that should be endured rather than alleviated through medicines that might interfere with God's purposes. The expansion of English maritime activity during the 16th century brought English sailors into direct contact with psychoactive substances used by populations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, creating opportunities for observation and experimentation that would eventually introduce new drugs to English markets. The coca leaves that Spanish conquistadors observed indigenous Andean populations chewing to combat altitude, sickness, and fatigue, represented one example of substances whose properties became known to Europeans through colonial encounters, though coca itself would not become significant in England until cocaine extraction in the 19th century. The tobacco that English sailors first encountered in the Caribbean during the 1560s represented the most immediately consequential new psychoactive substance to reach England during this period, as smoking spread rapidly, despite initial resistance from authorities who viewed the practice as foreign, unhealthy, and morally suspect. The kava roots that Pacific Island populations used in ritual contexts and the betel nuts consumed across South and Southeast Asia provided additional examples of regionally specific psychoactive substances that English travelers observed during the Age of Exploration, expanding European awareness of human diversity in substance use practices. The scientific revolution that transformed European intellectual life during the 17th century brought new approaches to understanding how medicines worked that gradually moved beyond Galenic humoral theories toward mechanical, later chemical explanations of drug actions. The experimental methods that natural philosophers developed for investigating natural phenomena created possibilities for systematic testing of substances' effects rather than relying solely on traditional knowledge and clinical observation. The improved microscopes that became available during this period enabled observation of biological structures at previously impossible scales, though the resolution remained insufficient for understanding cellular mechanisms underlying drug actions. The development of more sophisticated chemistry, including improved techniques for isolation and purification of active principles from plant materials, laid groundwork for the eventual transformation of pharmacology from an empirical art into a systematic science, though this process would require 2 more centuries to reach fruition. The coffeehouse culture that flourished in Restoration England created new social spaces where men gathered to consume caffeine-containing beverages while engaging in commercial transactions, political discussions, and intellectual exchanges that made these establishments crucial institutions in urban life. The stimulant effects of coffee promoted the alert, rational conversation that characterized coffeehouse discourse, creating pharmacological environments that differed markedly from the intoxicated sociability of ala houses and taverns. The association of coffeehouses with particular trades, professions, or political factions created specialized venues serving distinct clienteles, while the establishment's role as centers for information exchange made them important nodes in commercial and political networks. The attempts by government authorities to suppress or regulate coffeehouses during periods of political tension demonstrated official recognition of these establishments' potential as centers for seditious activity. though the economic benefits of the coffee trade and the popularity of coffee houses among influential urban populations limited the effectiveness of such restrictions. The development of marine insurance and other financial innovations during the 17th and 18th centuries facilitated long-distance trade by distributing risks among multiple investors and creating mechanisms for managing the uncertainties inherent in maritime commerce. The joint stock companies that organized much of England's overseas trade combined capital from numerous investors to finance expensive ventures while limiting individual liability, creating organizational forms that enabled larger and more sustained commercial operations than had been possible under earlier arrangements. The growing sophistication of commercial law provided frameworks for enforcing contracts, resolving disputes, and protecting property rights in ways that reduced transaction costs and encouraged market development. The financial infrastructure that emerged during this period supported dramatic expansion of trade, including importation of psychoactive substances from distant sources, making drugs like tea, coffee, and tobacco available to English consumers in quantities that transformed these luxury goods into everyday commodities. The gin crisis that peaked during the 1730s represented not simply excessive consumption of a particular beverage, but a complex social phenomenon reflecting urbanization's disruptive effects, economic conditions that left working-class populations vulnerable to alcohol's appeal as an escape from harsh realities, and commercial interests that profited from selling cheap spirits regardless of social consequences. The technological improvements in distillation that reduced production costs, combined with agricultural policies that created grain surpluses to make domestic spirits far more affordable than imported alternatives, democratizing access to strong alcohol in ways that previous scarcity and high prices had prevented. The concentration of gin consumption in London and other urban centres reflected both these communities' size and the social conditions that characterized early industrial cities, including overcrowding, poverty, lack of sanitation, and absence of recreational alternatives that might have competed with drinking for workers' time and money. The particular concern that authorities expressed about female gin drinking revealed gender anxieties about women's roles and behavior that extended beyond simple worries about public drunkenness to encompass fears about maternal neglect, sexual impropriety, and disruption of domestic life. The Gin Act of 1736 attempted to reduce consumption through imposing licensing fees of £50 per year for retailers and duties of 20 shillings per gallon on spirits, creating penalties so severe that they exceeded the enforcement capacity of 18th century government, while generating widespread resistance that rendered the law effectively void. The legislation's failure demonstrated the limits of prohibition-based approaches, when targeted substances remained easily produced from common materials and enjoyed strong popular demand that created economic incentives for illegal distribution. The riots and attacks on informers that accompanied enforcement attempts revealed the intensity of popular opposition to restrictions on gin access that working-class Londoners viewed as interference with customary rights to consume alcohol as they chose. The black market that flourished under the 1736 Act provided lessons about how prohibition drives commerce underground without eliminating consumption, while creating opportunities for criminal enterprise and corrupting enforcement officials through bribery. The more successful Gin Act of 1751 reduced licensing fees to manageable levels, while maintaining restrictions sufficient to create barriers to entry that reduced the number of retail outlets, without attempting complete prohibition that had proved unenforceable. The legislation's recognition that effective regulation required cooperation from the regulated population, rather than relying solely on coercive enforcement, represented important learning about policy design that would eventually influence approaches to other substance control problems. The gradual improvement of economic conditions during the later 18th century reduced some of the social desperation that had made gin so appealing to impoverished urban workers, while changing cultural attitudes toward public drunkenness created social sanctions that complemented legal restrictions. The gin crisis's eventual resolution through this combination of moderate regulation, economic improvement, and cultural change demonstrated that addressing substance problems required comprehensive approaches rather than simple reliance on legal prohibition. The opium trade that Britain conducted with China during the late 18th and 19th centuries created one of history's largest drug trafficking operations, as the East India Company systematically promoted opium cultivation in Bengal and organized exports to Chinese markets, despite Chinese government opposition to the trade. The enormous profits generated by opium sales to China provided crucial revenues for British India, while creating demand for Chinese tea, silk, and other products that British consumers desired, establishing triangular trade patterns that connected India, China, and Britain in relationships fundamentally structured around narcotics commerce. The Chinese government's attempts to suppress opium importation through prohibitions and eventually military action protecting their prohibition enforcement led to the Opium Wars of 1839 through 1842 and 1856 through 1860, conflicts that demonstrated British willingness to use military force to maintain drug trafficking operations that served imperial economic interests. The treaties that ended these wars forced China to legalize opium imports and cede Hong Kong to British control, establishing colonial relationships that would persist for over a century while ensuring continued flows of narcotics into Chinese markets. The contradiction between Britain's role as the world's largest drug trafficker promoting opium consumption in China and growing domestic concerns about opiate addiction created ethical tensions that critics of empire highlighted in challenging both the opium trade and the broader colonial system. The anti-opium movement that developed during the Victorian period brought together diverse constituencies, including missionaries concerned about the moral implications of drug trafficking, free trade advocates who objected to monopolistic practices, and political reformers who viewed the opium trade as an emblem of imperial injustice. The parliamentary debates over opium policy revealed conflicts between economic interests that benefited from the trade, strategic considerations regarding India's finances and Britain's position in Asia, and moral arguments that British drug trafficking contradicted the civilizing mission that imperialists claimed justified colonial rule. The eventual British withdrawal from the opium trade during the early 20th century resulted more from changing economic conditions and international diplomatic pressures than from domestic moral concerns, demonstrating how material interests shaped drug policy despite ethical objections. The patent medicine industry that flourished during the 19th century created largely unregulated markets for products containing opiates, cocaine, alcohol, and various other psychoactive substances marketed with extravagant therapeutic claims unsupported by evidence. The lack of requirements for accurate labeling meant that consumers often remained unaware of the active ingredients in products they purchased, creating risks of addiction to medicines taken for conditions like coughs, menstrual cramps, or infant teething pain. The testimonials and advertising that manufacturers used to promote their products exploited scientific language and medical authority to create impressions of legitimacy while avoiding the scrutiny that products claiming specific medical necessity indications would have received from physicians. The economic success of patent medicines demonstrated the profitability of drug marketing to mass consumer audiences while revealing the vulnerabilities that unregulated markets created for public health. The eventual movement toward regulating patent medicines emerged from coalitions, including medical professionals concerned about competition from unqualified vendors, pharmacists seeking to protect their market positions, and reformers motivated by public health considerations. The pharmaceutical industry's development during the 19th century transformed drug manufacturing from small-scale artisanal production by individual apothecaries into large-scale industrial operations employing chemical synthesis and standardized manufacturing processes. The isolation of morphine from opium in 1804 by Friedrich Serturner initiated a cascade of pharmaceutical discoveries, as chemists extracted and purified active constituents from various medicinal plants, creating more reliable products with consistent potencies that enabled more precise medical dosing. The synthesis of new compounds, including aspirin, barbiturates, and eventually amphetamines, expanded the range of available drugs beyond what could be obtained from natural sources, demonstrating chemistry's power to create novel substances with properties tailored for specific therapeutic applications. The growth of pharmaceutical companies into major industrial enterprises created powerful commercial interests in drug development and marketing that would increasingly influence medical practice and health policy through the 20th century. The hypodermic syringe's introduction revolutionized drug administration by enabling rapid delivery of substances directly into the bloodstream, producing effects within minutes rather than the longer delays associated with oral consumption. The enthusiasm that medical practitioners initially expressed for injection technology reflected beliefs that this administration route would somehow prevent addiction, since drugs would reach their sites of action without passing through the digestive system. A misconception that experience would soon disprove. The American Civil War's extensive use of morphine injection for treating wounded soldiers created the first large population of injection-induced addicts, demonstrating that this administration route actually increased rather than reduced addiction risk through producing more intense effects that reinforced compulsive use. The spread of injection technology beyond professional medical contexts during the late 19th century occurred despite growing recognition of addiction dangers, as the equipment became commercially available and some users learned injection techniques from medical encounters or other users. The morphine addiction that affected substantial numbers of middle-class women during the Victorian period reflected both the frequency with which physicians prescribed opiates for conditions like menstrual pain and nervous disorders that particularly affected female patients, and the limited alternative treatments available for these conditions. The gender dimensions of morphine addiction created social problems that differed from those associated with male alcohol abuse, as addicted women typically consume drugs privately in domestic settings rather than in public spaces, where their behavior might attract attention. The social stigma that nevertheless attached to female addiction, despite its medical origins, reflected broader Victorian anxieties about women's roles and the threats that drug use posed to maternal responsibilities and domestic management. The treatment approaches that developed for managing female morphine addiction often emphasized moral reformation and restoration of proper feminine behavior alongside medical interventions, revealing how gender norms shaped therapeutic practices. The cocaine enthusiasm that swept through medical communities during the 1880s demonstrated how initial excitement about new drugs' therapeutic potential could obscure dangers that became apparent only through wider experience with actual use patterns. Sigmund Freud's advocacy of cocaine, based on his personal experiments and limited clinical observations, exemplified the tendency of researchers to generalize from their own positive experiences without adequate consideration of how different individuals or use patterns might produce different outcomes. The medical applications that physicians explored for cocaine, including local anesthesia, treatment of morphine addiction, and various other conditions, achieved some legitimate successes, while the drug's stimulant and euphoric effects drove recreational use that rapidly revealed addiction potential. The swift reversal of medical opinion about cocaine, from wonder drug to dangerous substance, created one of the first clear examples of a pattern that would recur with other substances through the 20th century, as initial enthusiasm gave way to recognition of serious harms. The cocaine hydrochloride that pharmaceutical companies produced for medical use proved suitable for injection and insufflation, creating administration routes that produced intense effects and rapid addiction development. The cocaine injections that some users combined with morphine in speedball mixtures created particularly dangerous patterns of concurrent stimulant and depressant use that produced unique effects while compounding health risks. The paranoid psychosis that chronic cocaine use could induce represented a distinct psychiatric syndrome characterized by delusions of persecution and sometimes hallucinations that could produce violent behavior, creating public safety concerns that contributed to demands for strict regulation. The recognition that cocaine addiction proved extremely difficult to treat with available therapeutic approaches generated pessimism about possibilities for helping dependent users achieve recovery, though some physicians developed protocols combining gradual dose reduction with supportive care that achieved modest success with motivated patients. The international opium conventions that began with the Shanghai Commission of 1909 reflected growing recognition that drug problems required international cooperation, since substances moved across borders through trade networks that no single nation could control independently. The United States leadership in promoting international drug control reflected both domestic concerns about opiate and cocaine addiction and strategic interests in challenging European colonial drug trafficking that American officials viewed as impediments to their own commercial and political influence in Asia. The Hague Opium Convention of 1912 established the first comprehensive international drug control treaty, requiring signatory nations to restrict opium, morphine, and cocaine to medical and scientific uses, while implementing domestic regulations to prevent diversion to non-medical consumption. The convention's ratification created obligations for participating countries to enact legislation controlling these substances, establishing the international legal framework that would govern drug policy throughout the 20th century. The First World War's impact on British drug policy operated through multiple mechanisms, including concerns that substance use might undermine military effectiveness, disruption of international drug trafficking networks that reduced supplies of some substances, and emergency government powers that enabled regulatory interventions that might have been politically difficult during peacetime. The defense of the Realm Act's provisions restricting cocaine and opiate distribution represented responses to moral panics about soldiers' drug use and allegations that enemy agents were deliberately promoting addiction to weaken British military capabilities, claims that subsequent investigation revealed to be largely unfounded, but which nevertheless generated political pressure for controls. The wartime restrictions established precedents for government authority over drug distribution that would be extended and made permanent in subsequent legislation, creating the foundations for 20th century drug control systems. The relatively smooth implementation of wartime drug controls reflected both the emergency context that reduced resistance to government restrictions and the limited scale of recreational drug use that meant controls affected relatively small populations whose opposition could be more easily overcome than if restrictions had impacted larger groups with more political influence. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 created comprehensive regulatory frameworks that transformed legal status of opiates and cocaine from unrestricted availability, subject only to pharmacy sale requirements, to controlled substances, requiring prescriptions from authorized medical practitioners. The legislation's provisions, requiring registration of persons possessing or distributing controlled drugs, created bureaucratic systems for monitoring the legitimate drug supply, while establishing mechanisms for detecting diversion to excesses. Illicit uses. The criminal penalties that the Act imposed for unauthorized possession or distribution represented a fundamental shift in British drug policy from regulation focused primarily on ensuring product quality and managing access through professional gatekeeping to explicitly prohibiting non-medical use through criminal sanctions. The Home Office's role in administering the dangerous drugs regulations created centralized government authority over drug policy that would expand considerably during subsequent decades as additional substances were added to controls and enforcement mechanisms became more sophisticated. The Rolleston Committee, that investigated addiction treatment policy during the mid-1920s, produced recommendations affirming that physicians could legitimately prescribe opiates to addicted patients as maintenance therapy, when medical judgment determined that such treatment served patients' best interests. The committee's report established principles that came to be known internationally as the British system, distinguishing British approaches from more punitive American policies that had largely criminalized addiction and prohibited maintenance prescribing. The British system's emphasis on treating addiction as a medical condition requiring professional judgment rather than criminal behavior demanding punishment reflected both pragmatic recognition that prohibition alone could not eliminate drug use and professional medical authority over therapeutic decisions. The relatively small numbers of addicted individuals in Britain during this period, probably fewer than 1,000 people, made maintenance prescribing administratively feasible through the network of general practitioners and specialized physicians who treated these patients, creating a manageable system that might have proved overwhelmed if addiction had affected substantially larger populations. The international drug control regime that developed under League of Nations auspices during the interwar period attempted to restrict global drug supplies to legitimate medical and scientific needs through monitoring production, tracking international shipments, and investigating diversions to illicit markets. The Permanent Central Board and other League of Nations bodies collected statistical data from participating countries about drug production, consumption, and trade, creating transparency that was intended to enable early detection of suspicious activities that might indicate trafficking operations. The limitations of this international system became apparent as some producing countries failed to provide accurate data or implement effective domestic controls, while the profits available from illicit trade created powerful incentives for trafficking that monitoring systems could not prevent. The development of illicit drug manufacturing in countries outside the international control system demonstrated how prohibition created opportunities for criminal enterprises willing to operate outside legal constraints, establishing patterns that would intensify throughout the 20th century. The Second World War's disruption of international trade networks affected drug distribution through cutting supplies from Asian production regions that had provided much of the world's legal opium, and through creating a fiver, opportunities for black market operators to profit from wartime shortages and reduced government attention to drug enforcement. The military medical service's enormous demands for morphine to treat wounded soldiers ensured that pharmaceutical production of opiates continued at high levels, despite disruptions in raw opium supplies, leading to increased use of synthetic opioids and encouraging development of new analgesics. The wartime restrictions on civilian activities and enhanced government powers created environments where drug control could be implemented with less concern about civil liberties than would be acceptable during peacetime, establishing precedents for state authority that would influence post-war policy development. The relatively modest levels of recreational drug use during the war years meant that substances other than alcohol and tobacco attracted little public attention, allowing drug policy to remain primarily an administrative matter rather than becoming a major political issue. The National Health Service's establishment in 1948 created new frameworks for medical practice that affected drug prescribing through making healthcare free at point of service and establishing government responsibility for healthcare provision. The NHS's structure meant that addiction treatment costs would be borne by the public health system rather than by individual patients, potentially improving access to treatment while creating government interest in controlling healthcare costs, including expenses associated with maintenance prescribing. The bureaucratic oversight inherent in NHS operations created mechanisms for monitoring prescribing patterns and investigating cases where physicians appeared to be prescribing unusual quantities of controlled drugs, establishing surveillance capabilities that would eventually be employed to regulate medical practice related to addiction treatment. The relatively small numbers of known addicts during the NHS's early decades meant that addiction treatment remained a minor component of healthcare provision, attracting limited attention from policymakers focused on building the comprehensive health system. The emergence of amphetamine use during the 1950s and 1960s initially occurred primarily through diversion of pharmaceuticals prescribed for weight loss, depression, treatment, and narcolepsy rather than through illicit manufacturing. The widespread medical prescribing of amphetamines for these conditions created large supplies of pharmaceutical stimulants that could be diverted to non-medical use through various mechanisms, including patients selling their prescriptions, theft from pharmacies, and fraudulent prescriptions. The stimulant and euphoric effects of amphetamines made them attractive for recreational use, while the drug's abilities to enhance energy and postpone sleep made them popular in contexts where users valued sustained activity, including nightclubs and music venues. The recognition during the 1960s that amphetamines produced psychological dependence and could cause serious health problems, including psychotic reactions, led to tightening of prescribing guidelines and eventual reclassification as more restricted controlled substances, reducing but not eliminating their availability. The Brain Committee's investigations of British addiction treatment policy during the early 1960s revealed that small numbers of physicians were prescribing large quantities of heroin to growing patient populations while maintaining inadequate oversight of how prescribed drugs were used. The discovery that some patients receiving heroin prescriptions were selling portions of their supplies to other users demonstrated that the British system's assumptions about medical gatekeeping, preventing diversion to illicit markets no longer held as addiction patterns changed. The committee's recommendations for restricting heroin prescribing to specially licensed physicians and establishing specialized treatment clinics represented recognition that modifications were required to address problems that existing policies could not manage adequately. The implementation of these recommendations through the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1967 marked the end of the classical British system, while attempting to preserve principles of medical treatment for addiction within new institutional structures designed to prevent the problems that had emerged under the previous approach. The drug treatment clinics established during the late 1960s faced challenges in developing effective approaches to managing heroin addiction within the constraints of their government funding, professional staffing limitations, and sometimes conflicting objectives of providing medical care to individuals while preventing diversion of prescribed drugs to illicit markets. The debates within and between clinics regarding appropriate prescribing policies revealed tensions between different treatment philosophies, including harm reduction approaches that accepted long-term maintenance as a legitimate found outcome versus abstinence-oriented perspectives that viewed any continued drug use as treatment failure. The development of methadone maintenance as an alternative to heroin prescribing offered advantages of using a longer-acting opioid, less suitable for injection, that could be administered under supervised consumption, though some treatment providers and patients argued that heroin maintenance better served certain individuals' needs. The inconsistency in clinic policies regarding prescribing created situations where patients who were denied desired medications by one facility might seek treatment elsewhere, generating concerns about doctor shopping and the need for better coordination between treatment providers. The Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971's classification system attempted to categorize controlled substances according to their assessed harmfulness, while establishing penalties proportionate to these classifications. The Act's creation of 3 classes of drugs with Class A, including substances considered most dangerous, reflected efforts to develop rational policy frameworks based on scientific evidence about drugs' actual harms, rather than historical accident or moral panic. The reality that classification decisions inevitably involved subjective judgments about how to weight different types of harm, including addiction, potential, acute toxicity, and social impacts, meant that the system could not be purely scientific despite intentions to ground policy in evidence. The establishment of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs to provide expert advice on classification issues and other policy questions created institutional mechanisms for incorporating scientific expertise into policy development. Though the Council's recommendations sometimes conflicted with political considerations that ultimately determined policy outcomes, the cannabis debates that intensified during the 1970s revealed deep divisions in British society regarding appropriate responses to a drug that many young people used recreationally, despite its illegal status. The arguments that cannabis posed relatively modest health risks compared to legal substances like alcohol and tobacco challenged the rational basis for maintaining criminal prohibitions against marijuana possession while permitting far more dangerous drugs to be freely sold. The gateway hypothesis that cannabis use led to progression to harder drugs became a central argument for maintaining strict prohibitions, despite limited empirical support for the strong version of this claim that cannabis pharmacologically predisposed users to seek other substances. The cultural dimensions of cannabis policy debates reflected broader generation conflicts, as young people who viewed marijuana as a relatively harmless recreational drug confronted older generations who associated all illicit drug use with moral degradation and social danger. The heroin epidemic that emerged during the 1980s transformed British drug problems through dramatically expanding the population of dependent users while creating new patterns of drug-related crime and social disorder. The increased heroin availability that resulted from enhanced production in source countries and improved trafficking networks made the drug accessible in communities where it had previously been rare, while economic changes that eliminated traditional employment opportunities in northern England, Scotland, and Wales created populations of young people vulnerable to heroin's appeal. The recognition that addiction had spread beyond the relatively small bohemian populations that had characterized earlier periods to affect working-class youth in disadvantaged neighborhoods changed the social demography of the drug problem in ways that influenced policy responses. The association of heroin use with property crime, as dependent users stole to fund their drug purchases, created public concerns about drug-related criminality that extended beyond the direct harms of addiction to encompass secondary impacts on community safety and quality of life. The HIV/AIDS epidemic's intersection with injecting drug use during the mid-1980s created urgent public health crises that required responses balancing disease prevention against continued emphasis on achieving abstinence from drugs. The recognition that HIV transmission through sharing contaminated injection equipment posed serious threats not only to drug users, but also to their sexual partners and potentially to the broader population through blood supply. Contamination created imperatives for interventions that could reduce disease transmission even if they did not eliminate drug use. The development of needle exchange programs that provided clean injection equipment to active users represented pragmatic harm reduction approaches that some critics viewed as condoning illegal drug use, while proponents argued that preventing HIV transmission should take priority over concerns about sending wrong messages. The provision of HIV testing and counseling services targeting drug users created new interfaces between public health systems and populations that had often been marginalized from mainstream healthcare, establishing relationships that could potentially support movement into treatment when individuals became ready to address their substance use. The crack cocaine that appeared in British cities during the late 1980s created new categories of stimulant problems that differed significantly from the powder cocaine use that had previously characterized the British cocaine market. The smoking of crack rocks produced intense euphoria lasting only minutes, followed by severe dysphoria that encouraged compulsive redosing patterns that could rapidly consume users' financial resources while producing severe addiction. The affordability of individual crack rocks, compared to the gram quantities in which powder cocaine was typically sold, made the drug accessible to users who could not afford powder cocaine's higher unit costs, changing the demographics of cocaine use to include more economically disadvantaged populations. The concentration of crack markets in specific neighborhoods created visible street-level dealing operations that generated community concerns about disorder, while making crack the most publicly visible component of Britain's drug problem despite other substances, including heroin, affecting larger numbers of users. The violence that sometimes accompanied crack distribution reflected both the drug's profitability, creating incentives for violent competition over market territory, and the drug's effects on some users, producing paranoia and aggression. The gang involvement in crack distribution in some cities created organizational structures for drug dealing that differed from the more individualized operations characteristic of other drug markets, establishing criminal networks that engaged in various illegal activities beyond drug distribution. The concentration of crack-related criminal justice system contacts among racial minority populations created concerns about discriminatory enforcement, even as the objective reality that crack distribution had become concentrated in specific communities with large minority populations meant that aggressive enforcement in those areas would inevitably produce racially disparate impacts. The rave culture that emerged during the late 1980s brought ecstasy into widespread use among young people, participating in dance events, featuring electronic music, and creating new social contexts for drug consumption. The empathogenic effects of MDMA that produced feelings of emotional connection and openness made ecstasy particularly suited to the communal experiences that ravers sought, while the drug's stimulant properties enabled sustained dancing through long nights. The initial perception of ecstasy as a relatively safe drug that enhanced positive experiences without producing the obvious harms associated with heroin addiction or crack cocaine use contributed to rapid adoption among youth populations seeking novel forms of recreational experience. The deaths of several young people from complications of ecstasy use, including hypothermia and hyponatremia, generated moral panics and demands for strict enforcement, despite the relatively small numbers of fatalities compared to legal substances' mortality impacts. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994's provisions targeting rave culture demonstrated willingness to expand police powers substantially to address drug-related activities, creating controversial authorities, including seizure of sound equipment and prohibition of outdoor gatherings based on musical characteristics. The legislation's broad language defining prohibited activities raised civil liberties, concerns about restrictions on freedom of assembly, and expression that extended beyond drug control to encompass lawful activities that authorities associated with drug use. The practical effectiveness of these expanded powers remained limited, as rave culture adapted through shifting to licensed venues and less visible locations, while maintaining the drug use patterns that had characterized outdoor events. The eventual accommodation between authorities and commercial dance club operators created regulated environments for what had begun as countercultural activities, demonstrating how initially prohibited cultural practices could become accepted when integrated into legitimate commercial operations, subject to licensing and oversight. The expansion of drug treatment capacity during the 1990s reflected recognition that criminal justice responses alone could not adequately address addiction problems affecting substantial populations. The increasing availability of methadone maintenance programs provided accessible treatment options for heroin-dependent individuals, though quality and effectiveness varied considerably between programs, depending on factors including dosing practices, provision of counseling and support services, and program philosophies regarding appropriate treatment goals. The development of evidence-based treatment guidelines attempted to establish standards for effective practice, though implementation remained inconsistent, and some programs continued using approaches lacking empirical support. The establishment of systems for monitoring treatment outcomes created capabilities for evaluating program effectiveness, though translating evaluation findings into improved practice proved challenging given the multiple objectives and constraints affecting treatment delivery. The drug treatment and testing orders, introduced in 1998, created mechanisms for courts to mandate treatment as condition of probation or alternative to incarceration for drug-involved offenders, representing efforts to integrate criminal justice and treatment systems. The theoretical basis for these orders combined deterrence through threat of sanctions for non-compliance with treatment's potential for addressing underlying addiction, driving criminal behavior. The practical implementation faced challenges, including limited treatment capacity for court-mandated clients, questions about whether coerced treatment could be as effective as voluntary participation, and difficulties coordinating between criminal justice and healthcare systems with different cultures and priorities. The evaluation evidence regarding treatment orders' effectiveness produced mixed results, with some studies showing reduced criminality among participants, while others found limited impacts, reflecting the heterogeneity of programs and populations, making simple generalizations impossible. The National Treatment Agency's establishment in 2001 created centralized oversight attempting to improve drug treatment quality and consistency across England. The agency's responsibilities included developing treatment standards, monitoring service provision, and promoting implementation of evidence-based practices, though its influence depended on persuasion and funding leverage rather than direct regulatory authority over treatment providers. The emphasis on increasing treatment capacity and reducing waiting times for services achieved successes in expanding access, though concerns remained about whether rapid expansion had been accompanied by sufficient attention to treatment quality. The development of performance metrics and outcome monitoring systems created accountability mechanisms, though debates continued about whether measured indicators actually captured the dimensions of treatment quality most important for client outcomes. The cannabis reclassification from Class B to Class C in 2004 reflected assessments that the drug's harms did not warrant the same legal status as substances like amphetamines, while the decision's reversal in 2009 demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining evidence-based policies when political pressures pushed towards stricter controls. The debates surrounding these classification changes revealed tensions between scientific advisory processes and political decision-making, with the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs recommending against returning cannabis to Class B, while government ministers overruled this advice based on other considerations including public opinion and concerns about high-potency cannabis strains. The practical impacts of reclassification remained modest, as enforcement priorities and sentencing practices changed less dramatically than the formal legal status, demonstrating how implementation can differ significantly from legislative intent. The novel psychoactive substances that proliferated during the 2010s created challenges for regulatory systems, designed around controlling specifically listed chemicals. The synthetic cannabinoids, cathinones, and other compounds that manufacturers produce to mimic effects of traditional drugs, while avoiding controls, demonstrated how prohibition creates incentives for innovation that can produce substances potentially more dangerous than those being replaced. The legal high shops that openly sold these products until prohibition created situations where young people could purchase psychoactive substances without engaging with criminal markets, complicating enforcement while raising concerns about inadequately tested compounds' safety profiles. The Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016 attempted to address this problem through blanket prohibition based on psychoactive effects rather than specific chemical structures, though the broad scope raised concerns about impacts on legitimate research and commercial products, while enforcement proved difficult given the continuing emergence of novel compounds. The contemporary British drug landscape reflects accumulated impacts of over a century of prohibition, combined with ongoing evolution of substance use patterns and markets. The substantial resources devoted to enforcement, including police operations, prosecutions, and imprisonment, have not eliminated drug availability or prevented continued use by sizable populations, raising questions about cost-effectiveness and appropriate policy responses. The harm reduction approaches that have gained acceptance since the AIDS crisis represent pragmatic acknowledgements that enforcement and treatment cannot eliminate drug use, and that minimizing adverse consequences deserves priority even when abstinence remains unachievable for many users. The ongoing debates over drug policy reform reflect diverse perspectives on appropriate governmental responses, ranging from maintaining current prohibitions to partial decriminalization to comprehensive legalization and regulation, with evidence from jurisdictions implementing alternative approaches, providing data for assessing different policy options' likely impacts. The scientific understanding of addiction's neurobiological basis has advanced dramatically, revealing complex mechanisms involving reward circuitry, decision-making processes, and stress responses that contribute to compulsive use patterns. The recognition that addiction involves brain changes, rather than simply reflecting moral failings, has supported medical approaches to treatment, while the persistence of stigma continues to create barriers to care and recovery. The development of evidence-based treatments, including both behavioral interventions and pharmacological approaches, has improved outcomes, though significant proportions of addicted individuals continue to experience chronic relapsing, conditions requiring ongoing support. The role of social determinants in shaping drug use patterns has become increasingly recognized, with research demonstrating strong associations between substance problems and poverty, trauma exposure, adverse childhood experiences, and social isolation, suggesting that effective responses require addressing underlying social conditions alongside direct interventions targeting drug use. The future trajectory of British drug policy will depend on complex interactions between scientific evidence, political pressures, economic considerations, and cultural attitudes. The international examples of alternative approaches, including Portugal's decriminalization and various American states' cannabis legalization, provide data on policy options' impacts. Though applying lessons from other TENS-TASH, context requires considering differences in social conditions, drug use patterns, and institutional capacities. The persistence of psychoactive substance use throughout human history, despite varying legal statuses, suggests that policy question involves not whether such use will occur, but rather how societies can best manage it to minimize harms, while respecting individual autonomy. The British experience, spanning from unregulated availability through medical gatekeeping to criminal prohibition, offers insights about different approaches, possibilities, and limitations that may inform future efforts to develop more effective and humane drug policies. The amphetamine epidemic that developed during the 1960s revealed how pharmaceutical products intended for legitimate medical applications could be diverted to recreational use on massive scales when prescribing practices remained insufficiently regulated. The diet pills that physicians prescribed to millions of British women seeking weight loss contained amphetamine or related stimulants that produced appetite suppression alongside euphoria and increased energy that some users found desirable independent of any weight control objectives. The antidepressant medications that incorporated amphetamines reflected mid-20th century psychiatry's limited understanding of mood disorders and the mechanisms through which different drugs affected mental states, leading to prescribing practices that would later be recognized as inappropriate. The truck drivers, students, and shift workers who used amphetamines to combat fatigue and maintain alertness during extended periods of required wakefulness created user populations whose motivations differed from the euphoria-seeking that characterized recreational use in club contexts, demonstrating how the same substances served multiple purposes across different social settings. The mods and rockers conflicts that captured media attention during the mid-1960s involved youth subcultures whose drug use patterns reflected their distinct identities and social practices. The mods' embrace of amphetamines fit with their emphasis on sharp fashion, scooter culture, and all-night dancing at clubs featuring soul and rhythm and blues music, creating pharmaceutical enhancement of the energetic lifestyle they cultivated. The rockers' preference for alcohol and relative avoidance of amphetamines reflected their different cultural orientation toward motorcycle culture, rock and roll music, and more traditional working-class masculine values. The moral panic that developed around these youth subcultures focused primarily on their public disorder and violence, rather than their drug use specifically, though amphetamines' role in enabling the sustained activity that characterized mod lifestyle attracted some official concern. The media coverage that sensationalized conflicts between mods and rockers contributed to public anxieties about youth culture and social change that would influence subsequent responses to drug-related youth movements. The pharmaceutical industry's marketing of amphetamines during the 1950s and early 1960s employed aggressive promotional strategies that emphasized the drug's therapeutic benefits while minimizing addiction, risks, and adverse effects. The sales representatives who visited physicians' offices provided free samples and promotional materials that encouraged prescribing for increasingly broad ranges of conditions, extending well beyond the narcolepsy and severe attention disorders where amphetamines possessed clear therapeutic value. The medical journals that published advertisements for amphetamine products rarely subjected these promotional claims to the scrutiny that would later be required under more stringent advertising regulations, allowing pharmaceutical companies to shape medical opinion through marketing rather than rigorous evidence. The eventual recognition that amphetamines produce psychological dependence and serious adverse effects, including psychosis, led to dramatic reductions in medical prescribing during the 1970s, though by that point, substantial recreational markets had developed that continued independent of medical supply channels. The barbiturate drugs that had been widely prescribed as sedatives and sleeping aids during the early and mid-20th century created their own problems of dependence and dangerous interactions with alcohol that claimed numerous lives through accidental and intentional overdoses. The physical dependence that barbiturates produced proved even more dangerous than opiate addiction in some respects, as abrupt withdrawal could trigger seizures and potentially fatal complications, requiring careful medical management. The combination of barbiturates with alcohol produced synergistic depression of central nervous system function that could prove fatal at doses that might be survivable if either substance were consumed alone, creating risks that many users failed to appreciate. The eventual replacement of barbiturates with benzodiazepines during the 1960s and 70s reflected medical recognition that the older sedatives possessed unacceptable danger profiles, though benzodiazepines would eventually create their own dependence problems, despite initial beliefs that they were substantially safer. The teenage drug use surveys that began to be conducted systematically during the 1970s provided the first reliable data on the extent and patterns of substance use among young people, revealing that experimentation with illicit drugs had become far more common than previously recognized. The surveys demonstrated that cannabis use had spread to substantial minorities of secondary school students, with prevalence particularly high in urban areas and among older teenagers. The findings that most teenage drug users confined their consumption to cannabis and alcohol, while only small minorities progressed to heroin, cocaine, or other drugs considered more dangerous, challenged simplistic gateway theories, while supporting more nuanced understandings of how drug use patterns developed. The longitudinal studies that followed cohorts of young people over time revealed that most teenage drug experimentation proved transitory, with the majority of users reducing or ceasing use as they transitioned to adult roles and responsibilities, though minorities developed problematic patterns requiring intervention. The solvent abuse that emerged as a recognized problem during the 1970s and 80s involved primarily young teenagers who inhaled fumes from glues, aerosols, and other commercial products to achieve intoxication. The ready availability of these products in ordinary retail settings and their low cost made them accessible to young people who lacked access to illicit drugs or alcohol, creating a drug problem that conventional enforcement strategies could not address, since the substances involved had legitimate purposes, making prohibition impractical. The deaths that occurred from solvent abuse resulted from various mechanisms, including asphyxiation, cardiac arrhythmias, and accidents occurring while intoxicated, generating concerns about this form of substance use despite its relatively limited prevalence compared to alcohol or cannabis. The public health campaigns that attempted to reduce solvent abuse through education and restrictions on sales to minors achieved modest success, though the problem persisted, particularly among the most disadvantaged and marginalized young people. The punk rock movement that emerged during the mid-1970s created cultural spaces where drug use operated as one element within broader rejection of mainstream values and conventional social norms. The amphetamine use that characterized some segments of punk culture reflected the music's fast-paced, high-energy aesthetic, while also serving practical functions of enabling sustained activity during long nights of performance and socializing. The heroin use that affected some prominent punk musicians contributed to the drug's association with artistic authenticity and rebellious lifestyle, though this romanticization proved deadly for users who developed serious addictions. The punk culture's general hostility toward hippie drug culture and its emphasis on nihilism rather than consciousness expansion created different frameworks for understanding substance use compared to the psychedelic movements of the previous decade, though both involved drug consumption as part of countercultural identity formation. The football hooliganism that became a significant social problem during the 1970s and 80s involved alcohol as the primary drug facilitating and exacerbating violence, though some hooligan groups also used amphetamines and later cocaine. The drinking patterns that characterized match days included heavy consumption before, during, and after games, creating intoxicated crowds whose behavior posed significant public safety challenges. The violence between rival supporter groups reflected complex motivations, including territorial competition, masculine identity, performance, and simple enjoyment of fighting that alcohol disinhibition facilitated but did not solely cause. The policing strategies that developed in response to football hooliganism, including segregation of rival supporters, restrictions on alcohol sales at grounds, and banning orders for known troublemakers, represented comprehensive approaches to managing risks posed by combination of sport, tribalism, and intoxication. The AIDS crisis that emerged during the early 1980s transformed public health approaches to injecting drug use through creating urgent imperatives for interventions that could prevent HIV transmission, even if they did not eliminate drug consumption. The initial responses to AIDS among injecting drug users reflected confusion about transmission routes and appropriate prevention strategies, with some authorities advocating abstinence-only approaches, while others argued for pragmatic harm reduction, including needle exchange. The evidence that began accumulating during the mid-1980s demonstrated that needle exchange programs could reduce HIV transmission without increasing drug use, supporting expansion of these services despite continuing controversy. The integration of HIV testing, counseling, and treatment services with drug treatment programs created more comprehensive healthcare for populations that had often been marginalized from mainstream medicine, establishing models for addressing the intersecting health needs of substance users. The crack house phenomenon that developed in some British cities during the late 1980s and early 1990s involved premises where users gathered to smoke crack cocaine in social settings that combined drug use with prostitution and other criminal activities. The crack houses created neighborhood problems, including visible drug traffic, violence, property crime, and general disorder that generated intense community concerns and demands for law enforcement action. The legal tools that police employed against crack houses included drug trafficking charges against operators, closure orders for premises used for drug activities, and nuisance abatement procedures that enabled authorities to shut down problematic locations. The effectiveness of enforcement against crack houses proved limited by the ease with which operations could relocate to new premises, requiring sustained pressure to prevent problems from simply shifting to different locations within the same communities. The rave scene's evolution during the 1990s saw the culture's partial commercialization as licensed clubs incorporated elements of rave aesthetics and music, while subjecting events to regulation that limited the anarchic spontaneity of early unlicensed gatherings. The superclubs that emerged in cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool created legal venues for electronic dance music and associated drug use, generating substantial profits for operators while providing controlled environments that reduced some risks compared to outdoor raves. The door policies and security procedures that clubs implemented included searches for drugs and ejection of intoxicated patrons, though the effectiveness of these measures remained limited given the determination of many attendees to consume substances regardless of official prohibitions. The development of chill-out rooms and provision of free water represented harm reduction measures that clubs adopted partly from genuine concern for patron safety and partly to reduce liability risks from drug-related medical emergencies. The ketamine that began appearing in British club scenes during the late 1990s introduced a dissociative anesthetic, originally developed for medical use, that produced effects markedly different from other recreational drugs. The sense of detachment from body and environment that ketamine produced at moderate doses appealed to some users seeking novel experiences, though the confusion and motor impairment made the drug problematic in crowded club environments. The K-holes that resulted from high ketamine doses involved complete dissociation and inability to interact with environment, creating vulnerable states where users required protection from potential harms. The medical background of ketamine as a legitimate pharmaceutical meant that supplies came partly from diversion of pharmaceutical stocks alongside illicit manufacturing, creating dual-source markets comparable to those for other substances with medical applications. The GHB and GBL that emerged as club drugs during the late 1990s and early 2000s produced sedative and euphoric effects that some users found desirable, though the narrow margin between effective doses and dangerous overdoses created serious safety risks. The clear liquid form in which these substances typically circulated made them vulnerable to use as date rape drugs, generating concerns about drug-facilitated sexual assault that led to enhanced legal penalties for using these substances to incapacitate victims. The deaths that resulted from GHB overdoses, sometimes in combination with alcohol or other depressants, demonstrated the serious risks posed by drugs, whose effects varied dramatically with slight variations in dose and whose interactions with other substances could prove fatal. The eventual classification of GHB and GBL as controlled substances reflected assessments that their abuse potential and danger profile warranted legal restrictions despite some medical applications. The methadone maintenance programs that expanded substantially during the 1990s and 2000s represented British treatment systems' primary response to heroin addiction, though debates continued about appropriate program designs and treatment philosophies. The dosing practices that different programs employed varied from low-dose approaches intended to ease withdrawal during transition to abstinence, to higher maintenance doses intended to eliminate craving and enable sustained recovery. While continuing substitution therapy, the supervised consumption requirements that some programs implemented for new patients reflected concerns about methadone diversion to illicit markets, alongside recognition that daily clinic attendance created structure and enabled monitoring of patient progress. The evidence that adequate methadone doses, combined with psychosocial support, could enable many dependent users to stabilize their lives and reduce criminal activity, supported maintenance treatment, despite critics' arguments that indefinite prescribing simply substituted one addiction for another. The buprenorphine that became available as alternative maintenance treatment during the 2000s offered advantages including lower overdose risk compared to methadone and potential for less frequent dosing. That reduced clinic attendance requirements. The partial opioid agonist properties that distinguished buprenorphine from full agonists like methadone or heroin meant that the drug produced ceiling effects, limiting additional benefit from dose increases beyond certain levels while also making overdose less likely. The sublingual administration route that buprenorphine formulations employed created some barrier to injection, though determined users could still prepare the medication for intravenous use, despite manufacturers' efforts to design abuse-deterrent formulations. The evidence regarding buprenorphine's effectiveness relative to methadone remained mixed, with some studies showing comparable outcomes, while others suggested advantages for one or the other medication depending on patient characteristics and program features. The heroin-assisted treatment trials conducted during the 2000s investigated whether prescribed pharmaceutical heroin might benefit patients who had failed methadone maintenance, reviving approaches that had been abandoned when the clinic system replaced the British system during the 1970s. The trials demonstrated that some chronic heroin users who had not succeeded with methadone could achieve better outcomes, including reduced illicit drug use and criminal activity, when prescribed injectable heroin in supervised clinical settings. The interpretation of these findings proved controversial, with proponents arguing that evidence supported expanding heroin prescription for appropriate patients, while critics maintained that results did not justify the costs and practical complexities of supervised injection programs. The limited adoption of heroin-assisted treatment following the trials reflected both practical constraints, including clinic requirements and staffing needs, alongside political sensitivities about appearing to provide drugs that recreational users sought. The cognitive behavioral therapies that gained prominence in addiction treatment during the 1990s and 2000s offered structured approaches focusing on identifying triggers for drug use and developing coping skills to manage cravings and high-risk situations. The contingency management interventions that provided tangible rewards for verified abstinence demonstrated effectiveness in promoting behavior change, though funding limitations often prevented implementation of rewards substantial enough to compete with drugs' reinforcing effects. The motivational interviewing techniques that emphasized exploring ambivalence about change rather than confronting denial proved more effective than traditional confrontational approaches for engaging reluctant clients in treatment. The integration of these evidence-based psychosocial interventions with pharmacological treatments created comprehensive approaches addressing both biological and psychological aspects of addiction. The mutual aid groups, including Narcotics Anonymous and other 12-step programs, provided peer support networks that many recovering users found valuable for maintaining abstinence, though the spiritual emphasis and abstinence-only philosophy did not suit all individuals seeking help. The meetings that occurred daily in most cities created accessible sources of support that required no professional involvement or fees, making them available to users regardless of financial resources or treatment system capacity. The sponsorship relationships that experienced members developed with newcomers provided mentoring and accountability that helped many individuals navigate early recovery's challenges. The controversy regarding whether mutual aid groups should be integrated with professional treatment or maintained as separate peer-led alternatives reflected different perspectives on recovery pathways and appropriate roles for various forms of support. The drug consumption rooms that some countries established during the 2000s provided supervised facilities where users could inject pre-obtained drugs under medical observation, reducing overdose deaths and providing contact points for offering treatment and other services. The British government's resistance to implementing drug consumption rooms, despite evidence of their effectiveness in other countries, reflected political sensitivities about appearing to condone illegal drug use alongside practical concerns about locating such facilities without generating community opposition. The debates over drug consumption rooms revealed broader tensions in British drug policy between harm reduction approaches that accepted continued use while minimizing harms and abstinence-oriented perspectives that viewed any accommodation of drug use as ethically problematic. The eventual establishment of a drug consumption room in Glasgow during the late 2010s represented a significant policy shift, though similar facilities remained controversial and limited in number. The legal highs industry that flourished during the late 2000s and early 2010s demonstrated how prohibition created market opportunities for synthetic substances designed to evade legal controls while mimicking effects of traditional drugs. The head shops that sold these products created retail channels, making novel psychoactive substances available through ordinary commercial transactions, attracting young people who might not have sought drugs from street dealers. The synthetic cannabinoids marketed as spice, and similar brands produced effects claimed to resemble cannabis, though the chemical compounds actually bore little structural relationship to THC, and often proved more dangerous than the THC, natural drug they supposedly mimicked. The cathinone derivatives, sold as bath salts or plant food, produced stimulant effects comparable to amphetamines or cocaine, while their novel chemical structures initially placed them outside existing legal controls. The rapid pace of novel psychoactive substance development created regulatory challenges as manufacturers modified molecular structures to evade prohibitions as quickly as governments could schedule new compounds. The generic approach that the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016 attempted, through prohibiting entire classes of effects rather than specific chemicals, represented efforts to create more flexible controls that could adapt to continuing innovation. The enforcement difficulties that emerged following the Act's implementation reflected challenges in proving that substances produced psychoactive effects as defined by the legislation, alongside practical problems distinguishing 210 prohibited materials from chemically similar compounds with legitimate uses. The reduction in head shop sales of novel psychoactive substances following the Act suggested some effectiveness, though online distribution and conventional drug markets absorbed much of the displaced demand. The synthetic opioids, including fentanyl and its analogues that began causing overdose epidemics in North America during the mid-2010s, affected Britain more modestly, though growing evidence of their presence in British bash drug markets generated concerns about potential crises. The extreme potency of fentanyl compared to heroin meant that tiny quantities could produce fatal overdoses, while the difficulty distinguishing these substances from heroin created risks for users who unknowingly consumed more powerful drugs than intended. The naloxone distribution programs that equipped drug users and their associates with opioid antagonist medications capable of reversing overdoses represented harm reduction interventions that could prevent deaths from fentanyl and other opioids. The training programs that taught recognition of overdose symptoms and proper naloxone administration created networks of informal first responders who could intervene during the critical minutes before professional medical help arrived. The county lines drug distribution networks that expanded during the 2010s involved organized criminal groups based in major cities, establishing operations in smaller towns through exploiting vulnerable individuals, including children and adults with mental health or addiction problems. The phone lines that gave these operations their name enabled customers to order drugs remotely, with delivery provided by runners who were often young people coerced or enticed into distribution roles. The violence that accompanied county lines' expansion as groups competed for control of valuable market territory created serious harms for both participants and communities affected by drug-related crime. The cuckooing practices where dealers took over vulnerable people's homes as bases for drug operations created situations of exploitation and coercion that extended beyond simple drug distribution to encompass modern slavery and human trafficking concerns. The social media and encrypted messaging applications that became ubiquitous during the 2010s created new channels for drug marketing and distribution that challenged traditional enforcement approaches designed for street markets. The Instagram accounts and Snapchat connections that some dealers used for advertising products and arranging transactions operated openly while remaining difficult for authorities to monitor comprehensively, given the volume of social media activity and encryption that prevented interception of communications. The dark web marketplaces that enabled anonymous drug purchases using cryptocurrency represented more sophisticated distribution channels that replicated features of legitimate e-commerce, including vendor ratings, buyer protection, and customer service. The law enforcement operations that periodically shut down major dark web markets achieved temporary disruptions, though new platforms quickly emerged to serve continuing demand, demonstrating the resilience of distribution networks and the difficulties of enforcement strategies focused on supply interdiction. The cannabis legalization movements that gained momentum internationally during the 2010s created pressures for British policy reconsideration as jurisdictions, including several American states and Canada, implemented regulated markets for recreational marijuana. The evidence accumulating from these pioneering programs suggested that legalization could be implemented without catastrophic increases in use, while generating tax revenues and reducing criminal justice costs associated with enforcement of prohibition. The particular policy designs that different jurisdictions adopted varied substantially regarding licensing requirements, taxation levels, advertising restrictions, and approaches to managing potential social equity issues related to past enforcement's racially disparate impacts. The British government's continuing resistance to legalization, despite these international developments, reflected concerns about treaty obligations under international drug control conventions, alongside political calculations about public opinion and the messages that policy changes might send, particularly to young people. The medical cannabis access that Britain permitted beginning in 2018, following high-profile cases of children with severe epilepsy who appeared to benefit from cannabis-based treatments, created legal channels for medical use while maintaining prohibition of recreational consumption. The restrictive criteria that initially governed medical cannabis prescriptions meant that few patients could actually obtain legal access, generating frustrations among advocates who argued that the reform's practical impact remained minimal. The private clinics that emerged to provide medical cannabis prescriptions outside the NHS created two-tier access systems where affluent patients could obtain treatment, while those dependent on public healthcare often could not, raising equity concerns. The evidence base for medical cannabis efficacy remained contested, with strong support for some specific indications, including certain types of epilepsy and chemotherapy-induced nausea, while evidence for other commonly claimed benefits proved weaker. The psychedelic research renaissance that developed during the 2010s brought renewed scientific attention to substances, including psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA, that had been largely excluded from research for decades due to their controlled status and associated stigma. The trials investigating psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression demonstrated promising results, suggesting that psychedelics might offer breakthrough treatments for mental health conditions inadequately addressed by existing medications. The MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research for post-traumatic stress disorder similarly showed encouraging outcomes in preliminary studies, leading to expanded trials and regulatory pathways, potentially leading to medical approval. The cultural shift toward viewing psychedelics as legitimate research tools and potential medicines, rather than simply drugs of abuse, reflected both accumulating scientific evidence and changing generational attitudes toward these substances. The debates over drug policy reform that intensified during the 2010s encompassed diverse perspectives, ranging from those advocating continued prohibition with enhanced enforcement to proponents of comprehensive legalization and regulation of currently illicit substances. The evidence-based policy approaches that some advocates promoted emphasized systematic evaluation of different strategies' outcomes regarding public health, criminal justice, and social impacts, rather than assuming that prohibition necessarily served these objectives better than alternatives. The Portugal experience with decriminalization of personal drug possession that shifted responses from criminal justice to administrative sanctions and treatment referral provided influential example of alternative approach that appeared to achieve positive outcomes. The challenges of translating lessons from Portuguese or other contexts to Britain required considering differences in drug use patterns, treatment system capacity, and broader social conditions that might affect how similar policies would function in different settings. The racial disparities in drug law enforcement that research consistently documented revealed that stop-and-search powers and other police practices resulted in disproportionate criminal justice contacts for Black and minority ethnic communities, despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups. The explanations for these disparities involved complex combinations of geographic deployment patterns, concentrating police resources in minority neighborhoods, potential officer bias in deciding whom to search, and strategic enforcement decisions targeting street markets that were more visible in certain communities compared to private dealing that predominated elsewhere. The consequences of disparate enforcement extended beyond immediate criminal sanctions to include collateral impacts on employment, housing, and other life domains where criminal records created barriers, generating arguments that drug policy's harms fell disproportionately on already disadvantaged populations. The calls for reform to address these disparities included proposals ranging from changing enforcement practices to fundamental reconsideration of criminalization approaches that produced such inequitable impacts. The economic costs of drug policy, including enforcement expenditures, criminal justice processing, imprisonment, and health consequences of problematic use, totaled billions of pounds annually, generating questions about whether these resources might achieve better outcomes through alternative allocations. The estimates that enforcement consumed the largest share of drug policy spending, while treatment and prevention received comparatively modest resources, suggested that priorities might not align with evidence about most effective interventions. The opportunity costs of imprisoning drug offenders included not only direct incarceration expenses, but also lost economic productivity and impacts on families and communities affected by removal of imprisoned individuals. The cost-benefit analyses that attempted to compare different policy approaches faced methodological challenges, but generally suggested that treatment investments produced better returns than equivalent enforcement expenditures in terms of outcomes including reduced drug use and crime. The drug-related deaths that reached record levels during the late 2010s generated renewed concerns about the effectiveness of current approaches and arguments for policy reforms that might reduce fatalities. The deaths involving opioids, both prescribed and illicit, constituted the largest category of drug-related mortality, though deaths involving cocaine and other stimulants also contributed substantially to totals. The polydrug use that characterized many fatal overdoses complicated prevention efforts, as interventions targeting single substances proved insufficient when users combined multiple depressants or mixed stimulants with depressants in ways that produced unpredictable effects. The age distribution of drug deaths showed concentration among older users who had been consuming substances for decades rather than young experimenters, suggesting that mortality reflected chronic use consequences rather than naive experimentation by inexperienced users. The adulterants and contaminants that appeared in illicit drugs created additional risks beyond the substance's inherent dangers, as prohibition prevented quality control and left users vulnerable to consuming materials of unknown composition and purity. The fentanyl contamination of heroin supplies that caused epidemic deaths in North America demonstrated how profit-seeking by distributors could introduce extremely dangerous adulterants when users could not distinguish genuine from contaminated products. The synthetic cannabinoids sprayed onto plant material and sold as cannabis created situations where users expecting mild marijuana effects instead consumed potent compounds that produced severe adverse reactions, including psychosis and seizures. The testing services that some harm reduction organizations provided enabled users to check their drugs' compositions, though access to such services remained limited, and many users could not or did not utilize them. The criminal justice reforms that some advocates promoted included depenalization of drug possession, focusing enforcement resources on distribution rather than simple possession, which generated large numbers of arrests and prosecutions with questionable impacts on drug availability. The diversion programs that offered treatment and education as alternatives to prosecution for drug offenses represented another approach to reducing criminal justice system burdens, while potentially achieving better outcomes than punishment. The sealing or expunging of criminal records for drug offenses could reduce collateral consequences that impeded successful reintegration of former offenders, though implementation of such policies faced political resistance from those who opposed any steps that might appear soft on crime. The sentencing reforms that reduced penalties for drug offenses recognized that extremely long prison terms had not proven effective deterrents, while creating massive fiscal costs and human suffering. The international drug control regime that had governed national policies since early 20th century faced increasing challenges as countries adopted divergent approaches reflecting different assessments of prohibition's costs and benefits. The tensions between international treaty obligations requiring criminal sanctions for drug activities and domestic policy reforms, including decriminalization or legalization, created legal ambiguities that required resolution through treaty interpretation or modification. The debates within international drug policy forums revealed growing divisions between countries, maintaining strong prohibition commitments and those seeking flexibility for alternative approaches, with some nations advocating for treaty reforms that would explicitly permit regulated legal markets. The practical reality that international enforcement cooperation had not prevented flourishing global drug markets raised questions about the treaty system's effectiveness and whether resources devoted to international prohibition might achieve better results through different allocations. The public health approaches that many experts advocated emphasized evidence-based interventions to reduce drug-related harms, rather than pursuing elimination of use through criminal sanctions. The Portuguese model that decriminalized possession while expanding treatment access demonstrated that such approaches could achieve reductions in problematic use and drug-related mortality without the predicted increases in consumption. The Swiss heroin prescription program that provided pharmaceutical heroin to chronic users in supervised settings showed that even traditionally controversial interventions could produce positive outcomes, including reduced crime and improved health when properly implemented. The accumulating evidence from jurisdictions implementing public health-oriented reforms suggested that alternatives to prohibition could achieve better outcomes across multiple domains, including health, crime, and social welfare. The future directions of British drug policy remain uncertain as competing pressures push toward both continued prohibition and various forms of liberalization. The evidence base supporting public health approaches has strengthened considerably, though political barriers to major reforms remain substantial, given concerns about public opinion and international obligations. The demographic changes as older generations, with more conservative attitudes, are replaced by younger cohorts, with greater personal experience of drugs and more liberal policy preferences, may gradually shift the political calculus, favoring reform. The economic pressures, including costs of enforcement and potential revenues from regulated markets, create fiscal incentives for reconsidering prohibition, particularly given budget constraints facing British government. The evolution of drug markets, through technological changes and global supply chain developments, will continue, regardless of policy choices, requiring adaptive responses that acknowledge the dynamic character of the challenges. The historical trajectory of drug use in England, from ancient ritual practices through medical applications to contemporary recreational consumption, demonstrates both continuity and change in human relationships with psychoactive substances. The specific drugs that dominate use patterns have changed dramatically as new substances became available through exploration, trade, pharmaceutical development, and synthetic chemistry, while the fundamental human propensity for seeking altered consciousness remained constant. The policy approaches that societies employ to manage drug use similarly evolved from unregulated availability through medical gatekeeping to prohibition and potentially toward regulated legalization as understanding of costs and benefits of different frameworks developed through experience. The British experience across these historical periods offers lessons about both the possibilities and limitations of different policy approaches that may inform future efforts to develop more effective and humane responses to the enduring reality of psychoactive substance use in human societies.